And what other information of yours is the government able to access?
We certainly have ways in national security investigations to find out exactly what was said in that conversation. It's not necessarily something that the FBI is going to want to present in court, but it may help lead the investigation and or lead the questioning of her.
So somewhere it's being digitized, or they can actually get that? Because people were saying, look, that wouldn't be possible. It's pretty incredible what you're saying.
No, welcome to America. All of that stuff is being captured as we speak, whether we know it or like it or not.
The government is monitoring private phone calls, your children and my children's private phone calls, and tracking who their associates are.
It every time we text and tweet, call, or email. If the data is a picture made up of pixels, the metadata is the time, date, and location that picture was taken.
An operation called levitation, and this is Canada's
and what
program,
other information of yours is the government
worldwide surveillance.
We certainly have ways in national security
Cell phone
investigations
users
to find out
beware, Big Brother
exactly
may
what was
be
said in
listening.
that conversation.
The Federal Bureau
It's
of
not necessarily
Investigation
something that
can
the
now
FBI
hear
is going to want to
everything
present
you
in court,
say,
but it may
even
help
when
lead
the cell phone is
investigation
turned
and or
off.
lead the questioning of her.
So somewhere it's being digitized, or they can actually get that? Because people were saying, look, that wouldn't be possible. It's pretty incredible what you're saying.
No, welcome to America. All of that stuff is being captured as we speak, whether we know it or like it or not.
Every conversation you have, anything you exchange, no matter how intimate the content.
Legislation requiring telecommunications providers to keep the metadata and to continue to make it available to police and security agencies.
People are really feeling betrayed and let down.
Welcome to 2015, when citizens in the land of the free are being snatched off the streets or out of their homes and bundled into off-the-book police interrogation compounds, rendering them all but disappeared as far as their families or their attorneys are concerned. Be clear, this is no different to the CIA black sites which operated under the guise of a war in Iraq, and which, let's face it, murdered thousands of souls and destroyed the lives of millions of others. Welcome to 2015, where the 800-year-old Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, the Geneva Convention, international human rights, and the very constitutions which form the basis of our so-called civilization are shredded by technocrats who posture as leaders. With impunity, with no conscience, and they're backed up by a quadrillion-dollar death machine which you and I know as Big Brother, a creature which from bloody war to bloody war, a creature which you and I should start to call out for what it is: government gone rogue, political leadership run amok, systems gone insane, and a planetary ecology on the brink of catastrophic failure, until or unless you and I determine otherwise. Welcome to planet Earth in the year 2015, where brave and gentle souls who dare to protest against war and the slaughter of innocents are actually labeled terrorists by political leaders, your leaders, and media hounds who are only functionaries of a globalist criminal cartel of central bankers, warmongers, racketeers, and sociopaths. How else does a reasonable man or woman describe a world in which generational elites finance and propagandize themselves into power, and then bastardize the rule of law, diminish the sanctity of natural justice, and cripple the nature of organic society in such a way as to defile all morality, repudiate all spiritual dimension, and throw us back to the time of the Spanish Inquisition. How else does a rational soul describe a world where collecting rainwater on your own land will get you sent to prison? Where in some states it's illegal to grow your own vegetables, and where even if you're dying of cancer and you have ready access to a cancer cure, it is illegal, quote unquote, to take anything other than the treatment prescribed to you by the state. A treatment which will almost certainly kill you before the cancer does. Is this really the world of our choosing, where the state somehow crept into our lives and elected itself the right to decide whether or not we can marry or divorce, or raise a child, or send our children to a school of choice, or smoke a plant which makes us happy and healthy? When did this happen? When did we stop asking questions? And when did we stop giving a damn? How few men and women today are remotely aware of what lies beneath the crust of our civilization, the occultist agendas which lurk therein, the deep and mysterious enterprises of ancient priesthoods and their oftentimes malevolent legacies, which inform and steer so much of our reality. The eyes in the sky, satellite surveillance so advanced it can see a human hair on the ground. Ghosts above the clouds using prognostication technology which can practically predict movement and mobilization on the ground before it happens. Subtle, plain, visual scoping technologies which see through your walls, through your clothes, at your naked body, in your own bed, in your own home. And to what end? Did we allow our governments and military complex to develop these toys with our consent, to seize such inordinate power whilst we were rushing to work, feeding the kids, mowing the lawn? Did anybody ask you or I for our permission in all of this? Or did we just learn about this stuff as it emerges through Facebook or the next Hollywood blockbuster, the next video game, being played with incredible dexterity by our children at the breakfast table, when they might just as well engage in something old and wonderful called conversation, which in turn might just serve something even more old and magical called relationship. Relationship with family, with community, who knows, even with strangers in a beautiful and even stranger world where we are no longer bred to be fearful of one another, to be cast adrift from one another, and by proxy to be cast adrift by ourselves. Welcome to the inaugural New Earth Pure Truth Symposium. And to all of those who've taken the time to join us, you are very, very welcome. I'd like to introduce my favorite expert on the subject, my co-host, Mr. Paul Seils. Welcome, Paul.
Can you hear me? Hello, Sacha.
We have Paul online, and is he on audio?
Hello, Sacha. Can you hear me?
Paul, can you hear me okay?
We can hear you loud and clear. Can you hear me?
We can't hear you, my friend. Santi, are you there?
I am here, and we can hear Paul. Sacha, the problem is in your side. We can hear
Paul. Are you with us?
Okay. Thank you, Sacha. It's an interesting time that we're in at the moment. In light of the fact that what people have achieved and done recently with the likes of Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, who have put their personal lives on the line to bring us information for our own good. The line in the sand has been drawn. Enough is enough. If we can just move into the slides there, please, Santi. I just want to run through some of the things. I want to talk about first, what is metadata? I've realized too that it's gone over a lot of people's heads. What is metadata? It sounds like a technical geek term. Metadata means data collection of bulk data. So what does that mean in relation to you and I? That means every piece of communication, every email, every text message, every phone call is monitored. And the right to privacy is a basic fundamental human right that's been removed from it. And if enough people woke up to what's actually going on, they would be up in arms. Citizen 4, the documentary by Laura Croitras, I'd recommend anyone see it if you can. It's an amazing movie that exposes the overreach of the NSA that's basically capturing everyone's data. If we could just move along, I wanted to show you the next slide. This is one of the programs that Edward Snowden has exposed, called PRISM, P-R-I-S-M. PRISM is basically a program that runs to collect the data. What it does with the data is it brings it all together and it's harvested by artificial intelligence. And basically that'll be used, in my opinion, for profiling of people. And it's almost like pre-crime, the science fiction of movies like Minority Report, where that's being projected is actually reality at this point in time. Just in relation to the following slide. A former whistleblower came out and said, we've just had this metadata legislation that's just been passed in Australia. The amazing thing is that people like George Brandis, the Attorney General in Australia, have come out and said crazy comments like that, like we're not tracking what websites you visit, only the web address. This technology is being implemented by people that can't even understand or articulate the technology. So it's obviously directives that it's coming out of from someone else. We had in Australia just recently the Sydney siege, which achieved unprecedented exposure in the media. I've got a slideshow there recently. It covered something like 17 hours of continuous news footage. The gunman was killed, and the lawyer that was there, Katrina Dawson, she was actually killed by the police in the raid. But that was used for maximum capital expenditure for an agenda to bring in the metadata legislation. If you look at it in relation to the context for Australia, and the percentages are pretty much the same globally if you extrapolate them out. Since 1972, there's been 112 Australians killed by so-called acts of terrorism. That also rules out the possibility of any false flag type attacks. 88 of those were in the Bali bombings. In proportion to that, if you look on to the next slide, there was something like 2,500 Australians that died of heart disease. There was 800,000 people in the world that committed suicide last year. This is just insanity. I want to show you what some of the technology around in the next frame shows around the smartphone. Anything that's smart, smart phones, smart meters, smart televisions, they're not smart for you, they're smart for them. This is what metadata looks like for people that have smartphones. Basically, your position is GPS logged every 45 seconds, no matter where you are. This is an example that's taken from local media here in Australia, but also in the next frame, it shows someone's point of journey across the course of a couple of days. So that's completely being logged all the time. But showing the next frame, this is completely nothing new either. Because of research, particularly in the States, which Australia, and this agenda is getting rolled out globally, this is just not a localized issue. Governments also can read your email without a warrant that is six months old anyway. They've brought the legislation into Australia, which basically means it's dragnet surveillance, it's just capturing everyone's data all the time, completely dismissing the assumption of innocence, making everyone guilty until proven innocent. The legislation that's there basically incriminates everyone, and that's going to be taken and used civilly. In relation to the technology further in the next slide, please, Santi. The smart televisions. If you have a smart television, it's acknowledged by the companies that manufacture that that technology is being harvested and setting back to third party. In the next slide, if you think that's ridiculous, wait till you see this for the kids. This hello Barbie, Big Brother is watching it. Literally, that is a child's toy that is marketed, that's given to children, and that data is recorded from the conversations with the children and then also sent back to third parties. It's insane. Just the next slide there, please. Also, what we're seeing at this point in time is an intersection on cross-referencing of a few things that are happening simultaneously. You've got the anti-terrorism laws that are being brought out, you've got the metadata that's being brought out, you also have the whistleblower laws that are being rolled out, and you have the anti-piracy schemes. So if you look at what's happened recently in the next slide with the Dallas Buyers Club movie, that they're saying they have the rights to that technology under the TPP that's moving forward, and fair enough to some degree, under copyright, you have a right to exercise what's your property, but the Dallas Buyers Club is asking alleged illegal downloaders to name the name of their price instead of facing court. Last time I heard about this, it's actually called extortion. In relation to whistleblowers, for the next frame, it's interfacing with that. They've also brought in laws that that whistleblowers face 10 years jail. Since when is the burden of proof upon the people? Why isn't the burden of proof on the government for their lack of transparency? The next frame shows in the US, Jeffrey Sterling, who came out and blew the whistle and exposed the fact that they were trying to plant evidence on Iran to take preemptive action against them, and he blew the whistle. This guy's facing 100 years prison. There's been a couple of organisations that have been involved with trying to push and make people aware to the best of our ability, and that includes Electronic Frontiers in Australia, and also the next slide is in relation to the Pirate Party that's in Australia, but also rolling out globally, giving people, standing up for people's rights and protection around their internet freedom and their privacy. Like I said, the right to privacy is a basic fundamental human right that's being taken from us, and if we don't stand up for it, well, I don't know. The next slide I want to show you is in relation to one of the original whistleblowers. If you get a chance to watch this documentary by the guys at Hope and Tragedy, The Future of Freedom by William Binney. This guy's amazing. He talks about all the programs in explicit detail, right down to the wire. Like I said, if we're not prepared to stand up at this point in time and say this is wrong, we're going to be handing it over hook, line and sinker. We don't have a leg to stand on anymore. Over to you, Sacha. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you, Paul, very much for that. It falls on me now to introduce a very distinguished panel. I couldn't be more thrilled. Firstly, Foster Gamble needs precious little introduction to our New Earth family across the globe, nor yet to the tens of millions of viewers of Thrive the movie and millions of followers of Thrive the movement. Foster is president of Clear Compass Media and co-creator of the documentary Thrive. Prior to that, he taught the non-violent martial art of Aikido, facilitated conflict resolution through his course Interaction Dynamics. Foster also founded Mind Center, a brainwave feedback training center in Silicon Valley, and co-founded the Sequoia Symposium, a multidisciplinary scientific think tank exploring unification theory. Welcome, Foster. And please let us know what your introductory thoughts are on Big Brother. Is he there to look after you and I, or not?
Well, thank you, Sacha. It's a thrill to be with you and with this panel of inspiring and courageous allies. Thanks so much for having me on. You know, as I thought about the topic today of Big Brother out of control, I thought to myself, I'd like to approach this from a different angle than I do in a lot of my public conversations. You know, oftentimes I'm expected to be the Thrive movie guy or the conspiracy guy or the money guy or the new energy guy. And today, in approaching this topic, I'm inspired to come more from my experience as a martial artist. Like you mentioned, I studied karate and then Tai Chi, but really ultimately found the nonviolent martial art of Aikido. And I trained and taught that art for 15 years, and I rarely do it anymore, but it applies in everything that I do every day, particularly in the type of activities that we're talking about tonight, because we are under siege from every direction. I didn't know that I would need to use those martial arts skills that I was working on all those years. But I think it's particularly helpful to think in terms of how do we respond to this attack effectively and ideally non-violently. You know, there's a lot that I can share as the conversation goes on about the actual facts of the surveillance and police state. And I've done a series of blogs and public online events and I'll drop those links into the chat for people who want to go and explore a lot of the details of just all the different ways that we are tracked and monitored and manipulated and so forth. But I'd like to today talk more about the solutions, because the would-be controllers, they have an agenda that we laid out clearly, as clearly as we could in the movie, where they want to create a context where we need them, where we're raised from kindergarten that we have to have this daddy state and we have to respect authority and obey and so forth. And they want us to be convinced that they are the source of our remedy. And that's not working out so well. And clearly, when you stand back and look at it, they are diligent about doing their best to keep us afraid, deceived, overly busy, tired, stressed, sick, medicated, poor, and divided. But, you know, who are they really? A lot of people talk about they. And in Thrive, the movie, we showed a pyramid that follows the money up the levels from, you know, governments to corporations to small banks to big banks to international banks, ultimately up into the Bank of International Settlements and then into the secret societies and beyond, behind closed doors behind that. So once you realize that there's a very few people actually perpetrating this agenda, even though there are a lot carrying it out, and we outnumber them so vastly, it's really helpful to understand that it's a house of cards that depends on, number one, our obeying, our going along with their authority, and in fact, never questioning their authority. That's the main thing I think that they're afraid of is, you know, billions of conscious people waking up and naming, recognizing the covert slavery that we have been subjected to, and then finding in our own self-knowledge the capacity and the courage to stand up and do something about this. So, as I said, I could go into more detail about the, you know, the horrifying agenda that's going on, but I want to just set a context for what the heck can we do about this. There are people on this call who are much more expert than I in all the details of the attacks upon us. But what I want to suggest, and maybe, you know, follow up as we discuss, is there a way of harmoniously responding to this? In Aikido, I would teach my students, and I was taught by my teacher, don't go directly against the attack. And especially when you're talking about the shadow governments of the world who are, you know, controlling the money to buy off their minions and then actually controlling a monopoly on force in virtually every major nation in the world. It's not wise to go and poke them in the eye. It's not wise to try to, you know, to push them over, because that's what they like. That's what they're geared up for, and then they bring in the martial law and all that kind of stuff. So it's, I think, wiser. What I try to figure out is how can we respond in an Aikido way? When one is attacked, and when you're practicing Aikido, when you're being attacked, whether it's by a single person or multiple people or by weapons or whatever, the first thing that you do is get an accurate assessment of your reality. So if there's two people attacking in front and two behind, you better be aware of the ones behind also, or you're going to be out of the game very quickly. So a lot of people don't want to look at the bad news, but it's to their own peril. We really need to recognize the reality, and that's why I'm so grateful to the New Earth Nation and all of your team for putting on events like this that help to wake people up to what's really going on. That's not being negative. That's being real, so that we can be positive in a, you know, effective responses. So when someone attacks you in Aikido, the first thing you do is recognize it, then get out of the way of the attack, so you don't have to overcome its force or be overcome by it. And then you blend 100% with that attack. And once you join in with the direction that someone is attacking you, then the attack disappears. There's no longer a fight. There's no longer any resistance. And ideally, if you've blended fully enough, you can lead their body, you can lead their mind, their intention in the direction that you want to go. And then either you can disengage from them, and applying that to the surveillance state, the police state. If we could simply disengage and they would leave us alone, everybody who wanted to disengage was able to, no problem. But unfortunately, they are relentless. So it takes us to the second level of response of Aikido response to an attack, which is called immobilization. And that's where you take the blended energy and you turn it around and apply it back to the attacker themselves, so that you're not hurting them, but their aggression comes back on themselves until they're willing to stop the aggression, at which point the pain goes away and you can resolve you can neutralize the violence without having to injure the person. So sounds nice, but how does it apply to the surveillance state? In terms of disengagement, you can see it all over the world right now, that the BRICS countries are forming their new banks, their new economic systems, the new Shanghai Gold Exchange, their new rating agency, their new SWIFT alternative for international money transactions, which is going to be launching at least in the fall, if not earlier. And in fact, they're working on a whole new internet. So they're doing their best to disengage from the suppressive agenda of the Western banking cabal. And for ourselves, what can we do as individuals as well to try to disengage with that? And let me just summarize briefly what we can maybe go into in more detail. I know, Sacha, you're fully aware of this. I don't know how familiar the other panelists are or the listeners to this. But the key question for us at the Thrive Movement in addressing a situation like this is ultimately to look the attacker in the eye and say, by what authority do you claim to rule me? So that's the first question I want to just put on the table. Because as we follow it deeper and deeper, whether, it'd be more obvious if they were pharaohs or dictators or kings or something like that. They're just claiming it, and because they've got an army, you have to do it. It's a little subtler in our day and age, but I believe that the state is the new, more modern version of the pharaoh, the king, and the dictator. They try to make you think that you have a vote, but the fact of the matter is they're simply claiming power. And when they take your money as taxation, which is approaching 50% now, when you combine the various state and local and federal taxes, now most of that money on the federal level just goes to supporting the military and the Federal Reserve, exactly the people who are doing this to us. So if we can challenge that authority, and more people are doing this because they've traced back that even the claim of a constitution is a bunch of rich white men who sat down together and said, okay, how can we stay in control and disempower women, black people, anybody who doesn't own land, in other words, anyone who's not going to go along with the elite agenda. Now, of course, there's a lot of good things in the Constitution, but we never agreed to that. And what we're moving toward in the Thrive Movement is a world with rules but no rulers. Nobody has rights that other people don't have. So we need to ask ourselves, do political solutions work? How's that going for us? We started out with, the excitement about all men are created equal, and here we are 200 years later on the verge of a total global police state. So the next question that comes up for us is, what are the core principles to base solutions on? If it's not politics, it needs to be principles. And we found in the long run that's the only thing that works. So what we're finding is that more and more people who have traced back the so-called claim to authority in the courts and in the government realize that they don't want to be asked that question, because there's increasing evidence that even, obviously in Canada and Australia and the UK and many other countries, all of the Commonwealth countries and so forth, there is this allegiance to the Queen, and then the Queen has this allegiance to God, you know, as represented.
I think, forgive me, Foster, I think she has an allegiance to the Bishop of Rome before God, but do go on.
Okay, so I've got to get my scorecards straight here. In any case, it's all claims of authority. I was on a conversation recently with a famous lawyer in the U.S. where, and I was having him explain to me all these different tax laws and so forth, and I finally said, where does that authority actually come from? And he said, well, you know, all the states have charters and they've got laws. They've been around a long time, so, you know, that's the basis of authority. And I said, no, but where does the authority to make up those laws come from? And he had never been asked that question before. And he said, well, I guess it traces back to King George, and then it goes back to the Norman invasion of England in 1066. And I said, well, you know, we could go back and back forever, but what I'm getting is that you're saying there was an invasion by force that claimed an authority for a king, and now we're just getting a more subtle version of that same claim to authority. And he said, well, you know, I guess you're right. So the punchline of this is that more and more people like Charlie Miller and Cal Washington and Dean Clifford and these people like, you know, Santos Bonacci, these people who understand this and have been going into courts and effectively challenging this authority, because most countries have been turned back into corporations, and they're actually using commercial law, not even constitutional law. So when they try to sentence you for a victimless crime, and they expect your tacit agreement in order to claim authority. And,
the implied consent. The implied consent of the tacit agreement, yeah.
Exactly. So more and more people are going in and saying, well, okay, I hear your sentence, I hear your commercial offer, I don't agree to that, but I make a counter offer that's going to cost you this much. And when the judges, when you know, finance ministers, when heads of utility corporations are challenged with this kind of personal liability, it's actually blending with the system that they're covertly using and then putting the pressure back on them. And judges have been running out of courts, executives have been resigning from their positions, politicians have been resigning in order not to take on that personal liability.
Can I just say, Foster, we're going to get to the law aspect shortly, but as far as Dean Clifford's concerned, he was on my show on Wednesday night this week.
Oh, good.
He's come out a very angry guy. He's a fiercely intelligent man, as you know, and he's not pleased. He's just, it didn't bode too well. He ended up in prison for the best part of a year and a half, as I understand it.
Yes.
But he's come out with teeth and claws. And the Dean Clifford today is not the Dean Clifford before he went into prison. I'm rather pleased to see that myself, because I've often felt that the sovereign and common law element has been a little too softly spoken and has been railroaded by the status quo nonetheless. If I may, I'm going to bring in our next distinguished guest, Paul Craig Roberts, who has had careers in scholarship and academia, journalism, public service, and business. He is chairman of the Institute for Political Economy. He scores huge points in the credibility department for having been the former head of policy at the Department of the Treasury under Ronald Reagan, and a tenure as the editor of the Wall Street Journal, among a long list of other accolades. His research is impeccable, and his vision of how the world really operates, we all agree, is second to none. He knows why and when the global chess pieces are moving, and has the incredible talent to communicate difficult concepts to the general public, and that's you and me. He has written several books, including The Tyranny of Good Intentions and How the Economy Was Lost. Welcome, Paul Craig Roberts, and thank you so much for joining us from across the Atlantic. We'd love to hear your summary thoughts on the subject of Big Brother and his dirty box of tricks.
Well, he's redefined truth, and he's redefined facts. Truth and facts are what supports Big Brother's propaganda. People who go against the propaganda are redefined not as truth tellers, but as terrorists. And just a few days ago, in the U.S. Congress, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the chairman, Royce, they held a hearing in which the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee explicitly equated bloggers, that is, people who are offering views different from the propaganda. He explicitly equated them with the Islamic State, with ISIS. So if truth is only the propaganda that's favorable to Big Brother and his wars, and favorable to the corporations and the private interest groups that actually control the government, then it puts all the rest of us at a serious disadvantage, because we rely on truth to persuade people that they mustn't follow the propaganda, that Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction, that Assad in Syria did not use chemical weapons, that Iran did not have a nuclear weapons program, that Russia did not invade Ukraine. But to state these truths now means that you are a Russian agent, you are a terrorist, you are a propagandist. So those who use truth are now defined as propagandists. And those who lie, those who actually use propaganda, they are the ones speaking the truth. And in this hearing, a couple of the minor prostitutes that served Washington said that people who tell the truth are a cult. So what do you do when you have the House Foreign Relations Committee, Foreign Affairs Committee, take the position that truth is propaganda, it's terrorism, only what the government says can be accepted as truth, and anything that contradicts that is an enemy. So perhaps this explains why they listen to everyone's emails and cell phone calls and text messages. They're trying to find out people who employ truth so they can be isolated from the ones who accept the propaganda. I really don't know what this police state is all about. It's not something that's discussed. You would think by now that with all the institutions that exist, the universities, the bar associations, courts, you would think by now there would be some debate about what is the purpose of this universal spy. But there's not one. It's almost like it's not happening, even though we know it is. And
did Orwell understate the future, or did he overstate the future in 1984?
I think that he stated the future, because in 1984 there's no truth. There's only Big Brother's word, and that can change by the day. So what's true for Big Brother today might not be true tomorrow. So truth was ever changing as the propaganda changed. So I think that we're already in that world. If you look at what Gerald Celente calls the prostitutes, they're basically people who lie. And so if you have a media that basically lies, and then you have an alternative media in the internet where some people, some sites try to explain what's really going on, but they are the ones officially now who are lying. So this is Big Brother. I mean, but what is the purpose of it, and how widespread is it? Is it really around the world? It doesn't seem to be, because one of the targets of American propaganda is Russia, and another target is China. And in this hearing that I spoke about, the House Foreign Relations Committee, we had a situation where RT, Russia Today, is said to be a propaganda agency, and that whatever they report is propaganda, and the United States government is trying to find a way that it can combat the reports from RT, and large appropriations are being made to fight the propaganda that comes from RT's news reports. So wherever you look, as far as the United States is concerned, there is a monopoly on truth, and it's what the government says. And there's no such thing as any other form of truth. And as long as we have a situation like that, and they're prepared to enforce it, because it looks like they are starting to build enforcement mechanisms such that people who challenge the propaganda line are treated as if they are terrorists. So once you have that, then the prospect of anyone uttering truth, it is limited to the gulag, where the people in the gulag can speak to one another, perhaps.
And Paul, would the gulag be one of those countless FEMA camps that we see popping up all over the United States and Mexico?
Could well be. The reason for these detention centers has never been explained. Again, it's another great big elephant about which there's no public debate. There's no hearings. There's no conversation about it. In fact, just to report it, it means you're a conspiracy theorist. So even though the big elephant is there, and we do know that there was a $385 million appropriation from the United States government to a subsidiary of Halliburton to build these camps, nobody will actually admit that any such camps exist.
And yet we know who those chief stockholders are in those corporations, and their agendas have been well enshrined over many years. And we won't name names in this symposium because we don't need to get into that space. But thank you for that, your summary thoughts there, Paul. Greatly appreciate it. It's almost, the way you describe it, of course, resonates with all of us, but it's almost as though there is a battle between organic intelligence and inorganic forms, like sentient beings and non-sentient beings, without wanting to tiptoe too much into the esoteric. It very much feels that way to living men and women on the soil when they understand that these kinds of inane and insane decisions are being taken by the pinstripe suits. Well, and pinstripe skirts, let's be clear.
You know, I think that there's more going on than that. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had emerged concept of American superiority. In other words, it's we're like the Nazis, America über alles. And this is expressed as we are indispensable, we are exceptional. Well, if you're indispensable, it means other people are dispensable. If you are exceptional, it means the others aren't. And so this expression of American superiority, I think, is an important element in what's happening in the world, and it's the reason for the conflict that Washington has created with Russia and with China, because these are two countries that are rising powers, and they have sufficient means to act as a constraint on American unilateralism. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States became accustomed to having no constraints on its power. And now we see that Russia is able to constrain the power, and we see China also with this possibility. So I think that we're headed toward a massive war, because Washington and the powers that benefit from the control they can exercise over the government don't want any constraints and can't tolerate them. And so we see this enormous propaganda against Russia. And the only reason for this type of propaganda is to prepare people to accept war. There's no other reason for it.
Quite so. Thank you, Paul. I'm going to introduce our next guest, Pippa King, campaigns against intrusions to children's privacy in education, author of Biometrics in Schools and Against RFID in School Blogs. She campaigned from 2005 after her children were nearly fingerprinted at primary school for a library system, along with other parents and privacy organizations, against schools using children's biometrics and for parents to have openness and transparency on this topic. She continues to raise awareness of the wider implications on adult society with biometrics and RFID technology, pushing for debate and transparency. Welcome, Pippa. Thank you for joining us at this very late hour in the United Kingdom. And what is your introductory summary, please, on the big bad wolf we call modern government?
Well, I've had first-hand experience of, you know, my children and other children being at the sort of end of this big data mining that's going on in education at the moment. I think the thing that really bothered me with schools taking fingerprints for things like library books, food, access to areas is that it's sending a really subtle message to a child that in order to get these benefits, or what is, you know, is a normal activity, a mundane activity in school, you have to give up a measure of your body, which a biometric is, bio-life metric measure. And of course, this is where we're going with society and the whole Internet of Things, is that big data is only good if they know who it is, if they absolutely know who it is, who is using the big data. The problem with a smartphone is that I could use somebody's smartphone and somebody else could use their smartphone. So they can't tie it just down to the individual yet. When you bring biometrics in, you verify the individuals, and then you've got absolute profiling of an individual. You can predict their movements, you can predict their eating habits, their reading habits. And the data mining on children is immense, more so in the United States than I think it is in the UK at the moment. But they have computers that can track children's eye movements across the screen. It can track every click it makes on the computer. It can analyze, can the child learn maths better in the afternoon or the morning? Does it matter what the child's eaten when it's, you know, learning a subject as to where it's going? So that area of society is more data mined, and schools can collect a vast range of data, height, weight, attendance, how they do academically, in a way that we as adults don't at the moment. You know, we have our data in different areas of insurance, driving license database, passport, etc., but the children don't. That section of society is giving all its data to one institution, which essentially is the state. And the profiling that you can get from that data is extremely rich. For example, in Scotland in the year 2000, a company called AME, which is a big multinational company, got a public finance initiative contract for £1.2 billion to run all the schools in Glasgow, in that region, for 25 years. So they're getting the children at the age of 4 up to the age of 18. They can see what they're eating, they can see how they're learning, they can see their attendance habits, they can see what height they are, what weight they are, and that is a massive amount of data to give to one company. And children and parents are literally oblivious because of it. Because we just, I mean, when I went to school, it was a safe institution, that sort of thing wasn't going on, and I think, speaking as a parent now, my children are sort of in their late teens, because obviously this happened 10 years ago, we just give our kids over to the state and presume everything's okay, but it's actually not. We are the children's data controllers. We own that data. And we can ask the schools, what are you holding? How are you processing this data? But we don't, because we don't realise what's going on. And I think it's we've got a generation that is used to not questioning where their data is going, because we don't question it as parents, but also that they're compliant into using fingerprints to get into a smartphone or to log on to a computer, or having their faces scanned again to get into a smartphone. I know in Ireland, in order to get state benefit, you have to have a facial recognition scan. So in order to get money now, in order to get state benefits, you need to give up your biometrics to verify who you are. And the thing that's just around the corner is the Internet of Things. Once the Internet of Things kicks off, you're going to have billions of devices by 2020, all talking to each other. And the key way to get the information to profilers is to verify us through our biometrics. And at the moment, what we're seeing in the UK is a rollout of facial biometrics. When you have to give a fingerprint over or a palm scan, you have to do a physical movement to the scanner. But with facial biometrics, you don't. It's ubiquitous. And we've just had, just before Christmas, it was revealed that the UK police were running a national facial recognition database of over 18 million photographs that they'd been running since April last year. The Biometrics Commissioner stumbled across it just before Christmas, and it sort of hit the headlines over here in February. And the police have been working on this since 2012 with absolutely no transparency, discussion in Parliament. So it's been covert, and you just have to think, well, if that's covert and that's been going on, what else is going on? You know, I think we sort of see the tip of the iceberg, and it is people like Snowden and Assange that let us see the bigger picture, or part of the bigger picture anyway.
Indeed. Pippa, let me just interject, if I may. I mean, there is one thing we can do, which is to have the copyright symbol tattooed onto our foreheads and onto our registration plates on our vehicles, and then prosecute the municipal police for their criminal infractions. Forgive me, Pippa, I'm going to revert to you in a moment, but I would like to bring in our last panelist, so that he can be on camera and join us here. Max Igan is an author, researcher, filmmaker, and radio host. His calm but brutally honest demeanor has managed to awaken large numbers of people to the realities of the modern elitist system and the very real danger it poses to human freedom. Igan's common-sense, solution-based approach to the current human dilemma provides a balance and perspective that is much needed in addressing the global situation. His weekly show, Surviving the Matrix, attracted a massive audience since its inception in late 2008. And his website, thecrowhouse.com, contains a wealth of information, including extensive radio and literary archives. His films, all of which are available for free, can be accessed there. Max, thank you for joining us from Australia. What cursory thoughts on the Antipodean version of Big Brother Out of Control do you have? Just how serious a matter is it from where you stand?
Look, it's very serious a matter. It's really good that we're having panels like this to discuss the matter. It is extremely serious. What we've got to do, I think, we've seen this coming for a long time, really. I mean, this is a lot of what the internet was about to begin with. Not only did they give us access to each other, but they're able to pinpoint who's awake. and then they put out all these myriad of conspiracy theories out on the internet so they can see who's going to go down which rabbit holes, who picks up the right information, who's going where. So now we know where all the actual dissidents are, and it's always been leading to this. It always has. I think what we have to do, I like what Foster was saying before with the Aikido move. There are mechanisms in place within this system that we can use to combat this situation. Ultimately, the main problem that I think we face is the division of our communities, which is all a result of this system, because we're always running on the treadmill. We're measuring each other by social and economic parameters. We're judging each other by how big our front door is and what we perceive our economic achievements to be. And the result has been we've constructed a system which has a life form of its own. This is why it's so hard to combat things within the system by using its own mechanism, because what you find is that people have been giving a false version of reality. They've been sold a lie. Essentially, people will, they'll go through the education system, they'll get a job, and then they think, well, you've got to become a CEO or the head of a company, and you strive to make the company more successful. How do you do that? You make the company more efficient. You maximize profits and you minimize the workforce. So basically, you discard humanity and you make the system more efficient, and you're taught to believe this is success. So we've managed to build our own prison without knowing that we're doing it. And what we've got to realize is that the people who are running the system, our governments, these are simply public trustees that we employ to manage our infrastructure for us. That's all they are. They're no better than us. And we are the nation. The people of America are the nation of America. The people of Australia are the nation of Australia. Without us, there is no nation. Therefore, any insecurity that we face must be a national security. It's a threat to national security. Therefore, the government's putting in legislation which prohibits our ability to hold them accountable for their actions is really a threat to national security, if you want to get down to it. And all of these governments are in abuse of office, and they're all in breach of trust. I think we need to unite the community and stand together and ask these governments to show cause why they should not be held in abuse of office. And Exhibit A, the Earth. Have a look at the place. Look what they've done to the place. But we're not going to get any of this without united communities. That's the problem. And everything about these communities has been designed to disunite us. And when we try to approach it, we use the rules the system has given us. And the rules are there for them. They're not there for us. Even with the free man and the sovereign stuff and some of the successes people are having, this is temporary. The rules are only there to constrain you, to tie you up in red tape. Now that people are finding their way through the fiction, they've got to understand that it's fiction. It doesn't apply to them. The fiction is there to control you. And the policing that we're seeing now, what we're basically seeing is the politicians building private armies, i.e. the police force, to use against the citizens. And all of this metadata collection and all this spying on people is to find out who is wise to what they're up to and to hold them in check. That's what it's all about. And like this economic system, we're always supporting this economic system, which has caused us to build our own prison. And the economic system based on permanent growth will render the world uninhabitable in the end. We're destroying our own habitat by supporting numbers on a screen. I think we really have to look at this as an abuse of office by people that we actually employ to manage our infrastructure for us. We don't really need politicians in government. We need good managerial people with good managerial skills who can manage our infrastructure for us and lead us back to a point where we don't need government at all. The whole thing's a scam. It's a paper-based fictional reality, and because we believe the fiction's real, it manages to consolidate itself. All we have to do is enter into a business and make that business more efficient, and the system becomes more efficient. More of humanity gets discarded along the way. And they've been leading to this for a long time, Sacha. I think that's one of the reasons they brought the internet in, was just so they could lead us into this virtual world and get to a point where they're tracking everything we do and just keeping tabs on everybody. That's what it's all about.
And yes, indeed. And it's so obvious that it was an offshoot of the military complex. No small secret there. But, talk about micronations. People establishing themselves as micronations. I mean, the average man and woman in the street does not know this, and they really need to understand the mechanics of sovereignty. They need to understand that this consent that Foster was speaking about and the permissions that are assumed or presumed by the Crown or by the state were not given, but until we retract them using contract and using word, we are spellbound to them. and it's what gives the state or the crown or the local thug in a costume the assumed right to bludgeon us over the head or taser us or even murder us with impunity, as is happening all over the United States principally, but in many countries of the world. If people understood that they can stand up as an individual, they can engage in a series of processes, secession of their land from the presumption of the crown or the state, the municipal so-called authority, federal so-called authority. This is based on contracts which exist by virtue of the land registration schemes that are in place. The fact that you are indentured to the state or the crown through the treasury effectively is connected to the birth registration and certification process, which again from birth, literally from the moment that you have the umbilical cut, the certificate of live birth is flipped into effectively a birth registration certificate some days later. That in turn is converted through all sorts of sophisticated chicanery into a birth bond premise, and that birth bond effectively is traded. You are collateral on the stock market. This is one of the horror stories, absolute horror stories that we are learning about. And moreover, when our birth bonds, when we go to prison, our birth bonds become effectively prison bonds, and money is generated off our commonwealth for those invisible takers. So this is, again, part of the mechanics, part of the metric that underpins the status quo that people are never made conversant about. We're not taught this stuff in schools. Surprise, surprise. We're not taught about this in law school, and the Bar Association probably know almost nothing about this. But these are the facts. So the elites that understand this metric and the ones who are perpetrating metadata and dragnet surveillance against us for the reasons that Max cites and Paul Craig cites, to protect effectively a status quo, which is clearly in collapse one way or the other. That is evidenced by the fact that we are having this conversation, this round table. Treating yourself or your family to a greater nation is also possible. As Foster well understands, that is the premise of the New Earth Nation, is inviting people, families, communities of so-called sovereign people to engage in their own land holdings into a micronation, a satellite effectively, establishing a constitution, and then treating that micronation or that satellite to the greater New Earth Nation, which belongs to the world at large and is realized under pure truth and universal law, natural justice. Just so happens that we're backing it up with an ITNJ, International Tribunal for Natural Justice, which we'll speak to a little bit later on. I'm going to just introduce here a video made for us earlier by Noam Chomsky, the famed scholar who has often defined himself as a socialist anarchist. He's known for both his groundbreaking contributions to linguistics and his penetrating critiques of political systems. Noam Chomsky is an eminent linguist and radical political philosopher whose work from the 1950s revolutionized the field of linguistics. An icon of our time, he has gained a worldwide following as a political dissident for his analyses of the pernicious influence of economic elites on U.S. domestic politics, foreign policy, and intellectual culture. Santi, if you could just introduce the film.
We're now approaching the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta. Unfortunately, it will not be a celebration, more likely a mourning. Magna Carta, though limited, nevertheless had important steps forward. It established the concept of presumption of innocence and due process in what became Anglo-American law in limited ways, but nevertheless of some significance. Expanded over the years. It's by now an important part of the even international legal system. Up until recently, we're now in a period of regression where the concept has been virtually eviscerated. So, for example, President Obama's drone campaign defines guilty as targeted for assassination by the U.S. government. Defines due process as discussion in the executive branch. I'm not making that up, that's official, and there's many other cases. Now, the point is that the powerful do seek to protect themselves. One of the ways they seek to protect themselves is by massive surveillance of the population. That, of course, goes way back, but it reached its modern form with the U.S. invasion of the Philippines, early 20th century. After the invasion, which killed a couple 100,000 people, it was necessary to undermine and destroy the nationalist movement, which, and the remnants of it that persisted. And the U.S. instituted an extensive technique of surveillance of the population using the highest technology that was available in the day, and was able to develop a system which allowed the conquerors to undermine, destroy, eliminate the residues of the nationalist movement that had resisted the American invasion. Actually, the residue of that, traces of that, continue until the present day. Those methods were quickly applied at home in the usual manner. They were part of Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare, the harshest repression that's taken place in the United States. Same methods were used repeatedly in the future, more advanced, after the U.S. overthrow of the democratic government of Guatemala, 1954. Extensive surveillance techniques were developed which facilitated the operation of the death squads, other modes of repression which have turned Guatemala into a total catastrophe up until the present. Similar methods were used in 1963, military coup which overthrew the independent government of Iraq. CIA was able to provide detailed information for the coup regime, which incidentally brought Saddam Hussein into a significant role to murder and eliminate dissidents. And so it continues. The most extreme case of it is the huge NSA surveillance system, which was revealed mostly by Edward Snowden. And of course, there are counterparts in the private sector with extensive surveillance being carried out by the major corporations. What is the motive? The motive is that systems of power typically regard populations, including their own population, as an enemy, which has to be controlled. That's understandable. In conquered countries, like, say, the Philippines or Guatemala, you can slaughter them. In the domestic population, in the more free and democratic societies, you can't slaughter them, but there's still a problem. The reason is that, according to mainstream democratic theory, even at its liberal end, the population are what are called ignorant and meddlesome outsiders who have to be spectators, not participants. And you have to know a lot about them to make sure that they remain marginalized. Extensive surveillance is one of the techniques that's used for that. It makes it possible to go after and undermine sectors of the population that might try to break out of the spectator role and become active in the political system in ways that powerful systems don't want. And it's been used over and over. No time to run through the record here, and will be in the future. It's not irresistible, especially in the more free and democratic societies. There are ample means open to undermine and dismantle this system of control and surveillance, supervision, domination. But it's a hard task, and it takes energy and dedication. But that's the task that free and independent citizens who value their rights, who value freedom, must undertake.
Foster, Noam Chomsky is essentially telling us that if we wish to depart from the horrors of government tyranny and covert control, change will need to come from acts of bravery and consciousness on the part of you and I, the common citizenry. Thrive the movie and now Thrive the movement promotes a similar ethos. How successful have you been thus far as a movement for change when it comes to taking on Goliath? You'll need to unmute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, indeed.
All right, great. Yeah, I was just saying that I really appreciated Noam's analysis of that, just going right to the motive, because the motive exposes the illusion of authority. And as soon as somebody's trying to claim authority, the first thing they have to do is say that anybody who disagrees is illegal, you know, they're treasonous, seditionists, you know, all this stuff. And then they have to do the educational systems, the media systems, the surveillance system, all the stuff that we laid out in Thrive in order to try to keep that and to keep people from asking that fundamental question. So in response to your question, I've been thrilled with the progress so far that we feel we've been able to catalyze through Thrive. It's more than I anticipated, you know, less than I would hope, because it's such a big task. But as you know, everyone on this call knows, the first task is education. And people need to understand what's going on if they're going to respond to it. And there's a lot of pushback in our society by our, you know, by all of our own friends and families and institutions against challenging authority, against standing up for this sort of freedom. But you know, we didn't even have a marketing budget for Thrive. We poured it all into the making of the message, and it's now probably been seen, you know, beyond just the documented views. It's probably closer to 50 million people that have seen it in 29 languages, and it continues to be seen by over 1 million people a month. So that's just word of mouth. So people are trusting it, they're finding it to be of value, and they're passing it on to their spouses, their families, their people in their workplaces, spreading it around their networks. So that's really encouraging. We get tons of visitors to the website every day, and that was a lot of the intention of the movie, was to be a trailer for the website, just to capture people's interest, immerse them enough in this information that they at least go, huh, you know, that makes some sense, I think I'll at least check this out. So they're coming to the website, which we designed as a toolkit for the movement. And one of the things that we've been most encouraged by is that everywhere we went with the movie, there were spontaneously created Thrive-inspired solutions groups. So we created a hub on our website where they could all be in touch with each other if they want to share best practices, petitions, and lawsuits, and fundraising techniques and flyers, so they're not all having to reinvent the same wheel, whether they're taking on GMOs or chemtrails or banking schemes or surveillance or whatever. And they're using that now, and it is in fact saving them time. And we're delighted to say that we're over 1,000 groups in approximately 100 countries around the world now are using these tools and communicating with each other in a synergizing way. And that's what we were really hoping to catalyze, because we have no interest in running some global centralized authoritarian institution. We wouldn't want to do it, and it's never worked anyway. But what we're doing is trying to empower people with the knowledge, with the strategies, and with the connections to each other to stand up and take action. And we're thrilled to say that it's happening. And the one last piece I would add to that is that we've also been contacted by over 400 inventors, technological inventors in the areas of energy and medicine and agriculture, water purification, and now most recently there's a surge now of people who are doing amazing things in decontamination. And obviously with Fukushima and all the radiation all over the world right now, decontamination is a critical one. And then there are hundreds more of just social, environmental, and economic innovators who have contacted us with exciting ideas, but who are concerned that their ideas would be suppressed and they would be in danger if they brought it out. So we've created a project called Thrive Connect, where we're connecting the money with the innovators, and also we've created consulting teams, consulting in security, in legal, in marketing, in business strategy, and so forth, so that brilliant inventors don't have to try to do it all themselves. They can get the professional help they need, that they can get the funding they need to be safe, to be effective, and get this out into the world. So, you know, in the overall picture, it's a small step, but we're really encouraged as to the response that we've been getting and the waves that it's flowing out into the world.
Thank you, Foster. I mean, it's classic dragnet fellowship, I would call that.
I like that.
Paul Craig Roberts, during your tenure in the U.S. government, during the Reagan years, were you conversant at all with the hidden hand, so to speak? Were you aware of the nature of the machine that we see so explicitly nowadays in the form of overt government control, manipulation of domestic and foreign policy through deception and the promulgation of fear as standard practice? How did we lose our innocence?
It was a different world then. The government in Washington did not think that it was a unipower. It understood its power was constrained. One of the main concerns of President Reagan was to end the Cold War because of the threat of nuclear conflict. The American economy was doing well. It was mired in stagflation. So we had a situation where the world was different, and we had a situation where the press was more outspoken. President Reagan was severely criticized on a wide range of issues, some just, some unjustly. It was just not the same world at all, and there wasn't any sign of controlling powers. In fact, you see, Reagan was probably the last president we had that was not under the thumb of the private interest groups, because first of all, he was an outsider. He took the nomination away from the Republican establishment. And second, he was very old. He was an old man. He didn't want anything. And he came from a time where he just assumed the president had power. The president made decisions, and that other people didn't make them for him. All that's different now. We don't have that type of situation. They're very careful about who gets in the office. They're pre-selected, essentially. There's no more outsiders. Now,
Paul, who is the they, Paul? Forgive to interject. Who is the they, again, as far as you understand it, having been closer to the fulcrum of power than any of us?
Well, it was long after I left the government. I think what showed me that there was a fundamental change was the ability of Washington to concoct such an absurd story as 9/11. The notion that a handful of Saudi Arabians with no intelligence service behind them, that they were able to outwit all 16 American intelligence agencies, all intelligence agencies to allies, including Israel's Mossad, and cause airport security to fail 4 times in 1 hour, to cause the U.S. Air Force to be unable to get interceptor jets. If anything like this had happened, the president would have been screaming for an investigation. How could the national security state so totally fail? The Congress would have been screaming. The media would have been screaming. How could this happen? How could this happen? Instead, they resisted any kind of an investigation for over a year. And then they had this situation where they got a bunch of politicians to sit and listen to the government's explanation and to write it down. So when I saw that something like this could happen, and people fell for it, and the few people who could see nothing like this could possibly happen in reality and said anything about it, they were called conspiracy theorists. So we now have in the United States 2,300 high-rise architects, structural engineers who don't believe a word of it, who say it's impossible, that nothing like this, that the buildings themselves couldn't possibly have fallen for the reasons given. But all of these experts are conspiracy theorists. So that was sort of the beginning. And then when I saw when the Bush regime, George W. Bush regime, were planning to invade Iraq, and this really didn't make any sense. It had nothing to do with 9/11 or anything else, and the way they kind of worked around that. And then when I saw that Bush's father, former president George Herbert Walker Bush, and his Secretary of State Jim Baker, and they came out with a study backed by the old Republican establishment to nix all that, and it had no influence whatsoever. It just disappeared. Then I saw that the old Republican establishment was broken and no longer had any voice. So it was clear something was operating in the Bush regime that was new. It was a more aggressive kind of power, more reckless, more confident. And from that, we've seen what has transpired in the 21st century, because it was the Bush regime with the Patriot Act that began the police state assault on American liberties. Now, these liberties have been kind of gradually eroded over time, but it was from various interest groups chasing after devils. It was people chasing after crime, after the mafia, after drug lords, after child abusers. Each of these things impacted the protection that law gives to people. But it took the Patriot Act to launch the actual destruction of the United States Constitution. And that's what they've achieved. Habeas corpus is gone, due process is gone, and we even now have the situation where the President of the United States can draw up a list of people, including American citizens, to be assassinated without any evidence. Just somebody in the administration thinks they may be associated with terrorism. So this, I think, is a change. It's a big change. And if you look at the sort of things we're concerned about now, they weren't really there prior to the 21st century.
Paul, it's even worse, arguably, than you suggest. The last time I spoke with the president of the Global Security Institute, we're friendly. He told me that Washington seriously looking at introducing what they are calling retroactive legislation. Whereupon, one fine day, soon, in a courtroom near you, you're going to be held accountable for something you thought or did or said 3 months ago, 3 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. Quite extraordinary.
This all comes from Jeremy Bentham. Retroactive law, but also preemptive arrest. They will now, it's already something they do. They will arrest people that they suspect might create a crime in the future.
Yeah.
And so in fact, they'll use that more than the retroactive. They'll just say preemptively, we can't let this person stay loose because for this and that reason, it's an indication that he's dissident or he may be an opponent of our policies, he may do this, that, the other, and so this is already starting. And this is why you saw that the director of Homeland Security, the Department of Homeland Security, the woman who was rewarded by being made chancellor of the University of California, she said, while she was still running Homeland Security, that they had changed their focus away from terrorism to domestic extremists. And domestic extremists were war protesters, environmentalists, animal rights, anybody who might have an independent position different from whatever an official policy is. So I think that the law, as Chomsky spoke about, the kinds of liberty granted to people by constitutions written and unwritten in the Anglo-American world, I think that era is over. And I think the trouble, I agree with everyone that there is no authority for what they're doing. But they've got the might. They're there. They've got the police that they have militarized and turned against the public. They've got the Army, the National Guard. You may have seen the reports recently that we're now holding in the United States training exercises where the National Guard and the Army go into areas and act as if they have to subdue the population and occupy parts of the United States. And in their training, they refer to the public as the enemy. So when you see even National Guard now trained to view the public as the enemy, so who are they guarding?
Yeah, well, government nowadays has very little choice in order to preserve its own culture than to systemically abrogate and derogate all pure law, true law, in favor of statutory law.
I'm not sure of that, because what I've seen happen in the United States is that the forces for change have all been bought off. Look at the black civil rights movement. Well, first of all, they killed Martin Luther King, but if you look today, almost all of the so-called black leaders, they're bought off. They're given position. They're given money. Wherever you look, the forces for progressive change, if we want to call it that, they're bought off. They're co-opted. We even see it with many of the environmental organizations because they need money. So the corporations come and say, okay. And so the corporations get on the boards and they tone everything down. I mean, they still do some good, but they've lost that edge. They're being co-opted. Everyone gets co-opted. People who had a career like I had, the reason most people want that career is so they can be co-opted.
Yeah.
Because the rewards are high. if you turn away from that, they demonize you. So it's co-option is a very powerful tool. So I don't think the state is in danger because they have such monopoly on force and over us. So the question is, why are they making such an enormous drive for a police state? Now, I think it's mainly going on in the Anglo-American world. It's a Canadian, Australian, US, UK thing. I don't know if we, in fact, as far as I can tell, it's much freer in Russia and China. I don't know if this is going on in Italy and Greece.
Oh, it is. It most decidedly is taking place, Paul, pretty much throughout Europe and even in Eastern Europe now. That much is for sure. Paul, if I may, I'm going to ask Paul Seils, who's prepared a couple of questions for Pippa King and for Max Igan. Are you with us, Paul? You'll have to unmute.
Can you hear me, Sacha?
Yes, I can.
Okay. My first question is for Pippa. Are you there, Pippa?
Yeah.
I'd just like to, at the end, thanks for joining us today. I'd like to talk to you, just touch on quickly around the kids, because I think this is an interesting thing that we've all come into this process and we've seen it over a period of time. We're experiencing now children that are being born into this environment that are actually accepting it to be normal. There's intelligence there that tells us that programs like Facebook were originally funded and set up by the CIA as data mining, and it never ceases to amaze me how much information the children now are giving freely, like they're actually doing all the work for the agencies for them. What can we actually do as far as the children's concerned? And I know a lot of government departments and employment agencies and that sort of thing, their first port of call is to check someone out, is to look up their Facebook profile and see who they are and who they're hanging out with and what their social activities are and how they present themselves. What can we actually do to educate children to the issues of privacy and what they're actually volunteering freely?
I think one of the problems with technology is that in today's age of austerity and you've got two parents that are working, that technology can be used as a babysitter, and that parents do tend to abdicate responsibility to a tablet or a television from a very early age. I mean, we've got instances of children as young as 3 being addicted to iPads in the UK, certainly probably in the US as well. So I think we adults need to take charge of that responsibility in the family, possibly at school as well, but I don't think the message is going to come from school. Schools are literally throwing iPads and computers at kids. Kids are losing the ability to be able to do basic things like even write, because they're encouraged to put as much as they can onto whatever electronic device they've got, because of course it's easier to monitor them and assess their situation. So, but I really think that even though, because we haven't been brought up with that technology, deal with that when we were children, but we'd have to face up to the fact that it is our responsibility to make sure each one of our kids uses technology in a responsible nature. And I think, you know, they're so desensitized to what they put out there. They have no idea. And again, we as adults, we're all, as children and adults, moving really quickly into this technological age, that we've all got lessons to learn, and I think we need to take control of that and encourage children. You know, every keystroke they make is tracked, literally, either if it's on the internet or if it's on a educational computer. They need to be extremely careful, and I've certainly educated my children. They are the most boring Facebook friends. They don't put anything on social media. They watch, lots of stuff on YouTube, as teenage boys do, but they really don't, because I've said to them, this in 2 or 3 decades time, whatever you put on now can really come and bite you back. You don't know, but we've seen it happening already. But there's also a big push by, I don't know what it's like in the US, but the government over here, to have Facebook as your authentication, so as your login. So if you wanted to leave a comment on a newspaper site, you could only do it if you used your Facebook. And I think they're looking to use Facebook as an authentication for benefits. So that is your online authentication. And if that's the case, and I think that is the way it's definitely going to go, we all need to be uber careful of what we put on any social media site and even any digital footprint that we make. So yeah, I think it's our responsibility, definitely our responsibility. We all need to educate ourselves and our children.
Which is interesting also, because a lot of people are not aware of the fact that posts that are put on Facebook and even emails that are subsequently deleted are still cached, and they're kept on record. So if you've deleted something, the record's still kept there. It's not what goes on there, what goes on Facebook, what goes on social media stays on Facebook, on social media.
But also, sort of going back to what Paul was saying, you know, this pre-crime. The more information you leave out there, the more information there is to predict what you're going to do next. And I think that's the danger. That's where it's going. We've got artificial intelligence systems. We have in the UK, our first smart city that's being developed at the moment is Glasgow. And they have a CCTV or IPTV, Internet Protocol TV there, looking at the street scene, predicting hotspots where crime's going to occur. And it's only going to be a matter of a few years where they can predict it in humans. And it won't be other humans that are predicting this, it's artificial intelligence systems. And this is what's coming around the corner. And if you took it one stage further, if you could predict a crime, or an artificial intelligence system could predict a crime in a human, what then is stopping it from then looking through the reams of information and the laws and legislation we've got to analyse what crime it is that's been committed, and then to take it to the next stage? Would it then go through all the court records and analyse all the jury verdicts, and then actually then judge you on this? And whatever we're leaving digitally on the internet at the moment, whatever age you are, we have no idea how it's going to be used in the next 2 or 3 decades. We need to be very careful, I think, about what we do.
Thank you, Pippa. Max, I've got a question for you quickly as well. One of my primary drivers for me around wanting to expose this agenda is that a lot of us have had family members that have fought and died in wars, and for the protection of freedom that we're just basically voluntarily giving away. I know that you've been outspoken and doing this work for a long time, which I commend you for personally. Thank you so much. What else can you say and do to encourage other people to do their part towards the exposure of this matter?
Well, you know, you've got to work on your own sphere of influence. It's all about changing your own sphere of influence. I really think everything we're being provided here is opportunity for us. I really do. I think that there's never been a time in history that the system has made itself so apparent and so laid itself so bare for everybody to see. Everything that they're talking about, I mean, even with what Paul was saying before, how it's a removal of habeas corpus and all this sort of stuff. Habeas corpus is the cornerstone of democracy. This is the basis of our whole societies. If governments are putting in legislation which is removing habeas corpus from our legal system, this is abuse of office. It's a clear abuse of office. And we can ask our governments to show cause why we shouldn't take the necessary steps to express a loss of confidence in their ability to govern and have them dismissed, and put something transparent in place. There are mechanisms within the legal system that we can call abuse of office. Things like Gaza Strip, this is a war crime. Collective punishment is a war crime. Building settlements in occupied territory is a war crime. This is not a debatable point. You know, any of our governments that are supporting this war crime should be held accountable. They should be taken to the Hague and tried for war crimes. They don't, because we live in disunited communities. So what people can do individually is break down the barriers between yourself and your neighbours, but don't turn a fire hose of information onto them. Just help them explain that things are a little different to what they thought. Actually, there's a great book out by a lady called Rebecca Roth, which I recommend everybody read, called Methodical Illusion. It's a story of 9/11 told from the perspective of an airline hostess that questions all the problems with it. And I've found that it's fantastic because you can give it to people who are completely asleep, who don't want to look at conspiracy theories. You can give them an adventure story to read, and halfway through the book they get 9/11 truth dropped on them in a way that it's not a debatable point. And it's been massively successful in waking up droves and droves of people, because this is what we're dealing with. And even with the whole sovereignty thing, the birth certificate and all this sort of stuff, this is all very well. But they did all that without my permission. Now, I don't need to fill out forms and fill out anything to establish my sovereignty. If someone's claiming I'm not sovereign, I require them to show me proof of claim of that statement. because I am the only one who can do this with my body. I control this vessel that I inhabit. And if anyone's claiming they have a right of ownership over it, they need to show me proof of claim. And even the fact that they're doing that, this is an abuse of office. The fact that they're running this financial slavery system, this is an abuse of office. The fact that Fukushima exists, it's happening because of legislation that was put in place by governments. It's an abuse of office. All this legislation is put in place because we live in disunited communities. Now, anything you can do to break down the barriers in your community is a good thing. And to create, you know, we're working with a project I'm working on now called Full Circle Project, which I'm going to launch within the next 2 months, which is going to be aimed at putting together groups of 5 right throughout the planet and creating a system so that all these groups can be linked up and we can start making a difference on the ground, bring back something like direct democracy. But we've got to be prepared to stand up and call a spade a spade. These people are criminals, they're in clear abuse of office, and they only get the authority to do what they're doing from us. And we've got to call it for what it is. It's a clear abuse of office. You can't remove habeas corpus from the legal system and claim you're doing it for the benefit of the people. How does this benefit us? And these are our employees. They're not our rulers, they're employees. These are people we put into office to manage our infrastructure for us in a responsible way. And just look at our countries. The fact that they're removing all these rights from us and doing everything they're doing, all because they write rules on pieces of paper. It's just a paper-based reality. That's what it is.
Yes, it is. And again, we give it our full permission, do we not, Max? We give it our full permission. We put our attention. Well, we give our full permission until we recognize the part that we're playing in it. Whereupon we cross that line in the sand into sovereignty, by definition, into consciousness.
We give it our full permission simply because silence is acquiescence. But once we're aware of it, it's like you say, you know, once you are aware of this, if you have to fill out forms and do all this stuff to establish your freedom, how free do you think you are? You know, they need to show me that I'm not free. They need to show me that they are not in abuse of office for what they've done to this planet, because they only get their authority from me. And if I have everybody in the community standing with me, because we know who and what we are, we respect each other enough to respect those around us and not judge them by their economic standing or their social standing, and we stand up as one community and call a spade, they've got nowhere to go if we do that. But we've got to be prepared to speak our truth and call a spade and step out of the fiction, step out of the paper. We don't need any of their paper. You know, we need to step into our hearts and speak directly and speak truthfully and call it for what it is. Okay, you put this paper-based system in there where we're going to use bits of your paper-based reality to accuse you and charge you with abuse of office and have you removed from power and put something transparent in place and lead us back to a point where we can establish some freedom in the human condition. Because that's what this is about. All of this is about the loss of freedom, and it's about controlling everything you do. That's what they harvest. They don't harvest your wealth. They harvest you. They harvest your energy. They make you walk between the lines and do what you're told. And it removes all creative potential from the human experience. And I think that the fact that we're seeing it so clearly now is the greatest opportunity for freedom we've ever had if we choose to step into our power. I really believe we can do it.
Nicely put, Max. And, you know, your counterpart on the other side of the Atlantic, Gerald Celente, who I spoke with earlier, was very happy to participate in this symposium. Gerald Celente is a futurist, a trends research and analyst expert, and a featured media guest. As the founder of the Trends Research Institute, he is well respected for his track record of picking business, consumer, political, and economic trends before they come to pass. It is his job to see the future and understand how the issues and events of today will determine the trends of tomorrow. He is author of Trends 2000 and publisher of the Trends Journal. Published and documented evidence proves that his institute has produced the most accurate, timely, and comprehensive forecasts, and this is what he had to say earlier today. Santa, you can roll the film. Gerald, thank you so much for joining us at the inaugural Pure Truth Symposium. We couldn't be more delighted.
Well, thank you.
We're seeing governments all over the world bringing in metadata laws for monitoring of citizens by the NSA, the CIA, grabbing of data as exposed by Edward Snowden. Where do you see this going, and what is the end game?
Well, where we see it going is what we've been writing about for years. It's the loss of rights from people around the world. There's no democracies anymore. Let's stop calling them that. You name the country, you have a couple of ruling parties that don't want anybody else to share power, and all they do is sell fear and hysteria, and in selling that, they rob us of our rights. Look what's going on here in the States. You had a guy jump over the White House fence, run in there, and run around the joint. They couldn't stop a guy from doing that. A couple of days ago, a guy in a gyrocopter landed on the Capitol lawn. They couldn't stop that. But yet they have us afraid of ISIS, and before that, afraid of Al-Qaeda. So what they do, and you saw what happened in France with the Charlie Hebdo. Same thing. Where they killed 17 people? And you see the cops around and all the military with their armaments in front of the Eiffel Tower. Oh yeah, they know that they're there in front of the Eiffel Tower. Let's blow it up. They do that to put the fear in front of the people. They can't stop anything. We got millions of people flooding over the borders over here. But they keep using this to rob us of our rights so they can stay in control. So people are fearful to speak out and stand up. America has become a country of cowards. They let little boys and little girls run and ruin their lives, just like over there in the UK or anywhere else in France. How can any self-respecting human being look up to a Cameron or a Hollande or an Obama or a Bush or a Clinton or a Pelosi or a Feinstein or a Graham or a McCain? Look what happened over there in Europe a couple of days ago. A young woman with more cojones than any man that I've seen out there in a long time jumps on the stage in front of Mario Draghi. Yeah, Mario Draghi, what is an Italian? It's a disgrace for me to see this guy call himself an Italian. This is the guy, of course, that people know of as the head of the European Central Bank. And he's giving a talk about why they have to rape the people of their money under the guise of austerity measures and quantitative easing. Now, Mario Draghi also, before this, was the head of the Goldman Sachs gang's European division. He is the low-life little man, and I say that because the pictures prove it, that did the deal with Greece, that allowed Greece to get into the Euro group when they weren't qualified. They lied their way in. Anyway, going back to last week, this young woman jumps up on the stage and then onto the table, and here's what brave Mario Draghi did. Froze. A little boy, just like the rest of them. They only talk tough when they got their goons around them. So let's go back to your question. That's all this is. The goon squads are in charge of keeping the people that they protect. That's all they are. They're protectors for the criminals in charge. No different than the Gestapo. I want to read to you from the same Trends Journal, because what I'm talking about is bigger than the metadata. It's putting in place the military-industrial complex and the intelligence complex right in front of the people's face. Here. In preparing the ground for martial law, remember this is from 2012, Section 1031 of the Senate bill effectively repeals the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878 by authorizing the military to carry out law enforcement functions on American soil, a function that previously had been the province of the police. Right there in law.
Oh, yeah.
So you're going to start seeing military law being put in place in a country near you as these economies, this Ponzi scheme ends. And it's clearly a Ponzi scheme. So I go back to the Posse Comitatus Act. If Bush was president when this happened, the little weedy liberals would be screaming Bush. If the military maneuvers were going on around the country as they're scheduled to go on in July through September, they'd be screaming military rule. But when their Obama does it, they turn a blind eye. They have no courage.
Well, to recognize their failure in understanding the creature Obama means they would have to look in a mirror rather hard, and most people are not equal to that, it would appear.
You got it. Exactly. You nailed it, Sasha. They can't look in the mirror.
Gerald, you made comments recently about U.S. Treasury Department issuing survival kits to every major bank. What the hell is happening with this?
Again, you're looking at, you have to understand the people that are in control. There's sociopaths and psychopaths. So what they're doing is they'll take every measure to protect, again, they're enforcers for the crime bosses. When I tried to withdraw large sums of money out of the banking system, they started to harass me. Whether it was Key Bank over here in Kingston, New York, or HSBC. Yes.
But good heavens, man, you didn't believe that that money belonged to you, did you? For heaven's sake, it belongs to the Queen of England, the Vatican.
Exactly. So that's all who's in charge. Cowards. Yep. I used to be on Oprah, the Today Show, Good Morning America. You name the show, I was on it many times. I got blackballed from everyone because they asked me about what happened on 9/11. So when you talk about the metadata, on and on and on, those are just little pieces that when the revolutions do start, they'll have all the data to bring down anybody that they suspect of being a threat to the criminal operation. Yeah. They like to call them the Democrats and the Republicans.
Yeah.
I prefer to call them the Bloods and the Crips because they're murderers and thieves. They murder millions of people in the name of bringing freedom and democracy to a country near you, and they steal our money in the name of too big to fail, bailouts, and special deals for their buddies. I mean, you look what's going on in the Middle East. You know, now the Saudis are slaughtering people in Yemen. And just to show you the disgust of it all, the Saudi ambassador announced that they were going to go to war against Yemen from Washington, D.C.
Well, my understanding was that the House of Saud was a franchise of the Texas oil mafia. That's just my assumption here. I mean, they're all in it together. They've been kicking around for years. I mean, this is part of the great unfoldment that we're seeing, is this multi-generational racketeering roundabout. Now, I have to say that for a terrorist, Mr. Celente, you sure look dapper the way you dress. Are you allowed to travel? Are you on any hit lists?
No. Actually, I have a global pass. I could even go through, you know, the security easily.
Gerald, I am painfully aware of your schedule. You were supposed to be somewhere else 5 minutes ago. I thank you so much for joining our inaugural Pure Truth Symposium. And sir, be warned, I'm going to be in touch with you shortly.
Thank you so much, and thank you for all you're doing, because as someone once said, the truth will make you free. Thank you.
Well, Big Brother is perhaps not that big after all. as certainly that's the way that Gerald seems to illustrate it perfectly, with how our technocratic leaders in pinstripe suits are only as big as their close protection security, their militias, and their military hardware. Behind that smoke and mirrors are little girls and boys, often as not people, human beings with unresolved mommy and daddy issues much of the time, one suspects, because power has a tendency to bring the wrong kind of creature to its false light. I'm painfully aware that we have almost arrived at 2 hours, and I had suggested that some of our guests might have to leave at that time. Pippa has kindly said she'll stay on into the 3rd hour, and Max, Igan, the same. Paul Seils will be there. I will as well, to field as many questions as possible from folks who are watching this and other questions that were sent in earlier. But Paul Craig was with us for 2 hours, and Paul, you're more than welcome to stay with us for longer. But just before we give you leave of absence, in the event that you do need to go somewhere, and the same with you, Foster, hope you can stay on a little bit, but if you can't, no problem. I wanted to invite the two of you to parlay a little bit and speak. Are there any questions, Foster, that you'd like to level at Paul Craig Roberts as we have him with us?
Sure, that would be a wonderful opportunity. I would love to press Paul a little more while we've got him on to follow up on your question of who is they. You know, he was around in previous administrations enough to realize that some things have changed. But I would love two things. One, to get a little more of a sense of what are the organizations, what's the structure, or you don't even need to name names, but what is the general identity of the people who are even more powerful than the administrations and the military and the agencies and so forth. And my second thing maybe you could address is when you said, Paul, that you don't think that the state is in danger. I understand your point because of this infrastructure that they've got in place, but I'm not so sure I would agree with the conclusion because of the fact that they're bankrupt. With the level of debt, at least in the overt government, and the level of debt that's in the banks, all the major banks, and the way that the rest of the world is now isolating them, I'm not confident in any strength of the dollar or this illusion of recovery. So I think actually that one of the reasons why we're seeing all this, Jade Helm type of preparation for potential false flag events and trying to start wars and so forth is because some of them at the very top of the pyramid in the West may see this as their only way out of what the exposure that they're getting, the potential prosecution that they would be facing, and the collapse of their economic system. So if Paul could address those two things a little bit, who are they, and are they safe from bankruptcy?
Okay, Foster. In my opinion, they are the military security complex, Wall Street, the Israel lobby, the extractive industries, mining, timber, energy, and agribusiness. These are the major sources of campaign funds for the House, the Senate, the presidency. And so when someone gets elected to the presidency, to the Senate, to the House, they are responsible to these groups that gave them the money to get there. They're not responsible to the people, and they don't think they're responsible to the people. They respond to the money. And these are the powerful private interest groups that essentially control most of the policy agendas. So policy is done to help the energy companies, to help the banks, to be sure there's a constant flow of profits into the military security complex. and so on. And that's the way the policy works. Now, this is relatively new, in my opinion. Two things have brought this on. One, during the Clinton regime, there was a early retirement policy put onto the civil service to encourage early retirements in order to create room for women and minorities. And so the country lost the civil service, who had been there for years. They were powerful. They had influence over policy. When I was in the Treasury, I had about 100 of these people, and you couldn't do anything if you couldn't work with them. They're gone. The other big change is when the United States or the capitalists offshored the jobs, they destroyed the labor unions. And this forced the Democrats to rely on the same source of campaign finance as Republicans. Prior to that, the Democrats represented workers and Republicans represented business, and there was some semblance of balance. But when so many of the manufacturing jobs offshored, and now even the professional service jobs, tradable jobs, software engineering, information technology, that sort of thing, you have a situation where the Democrats have had to turn to the banks, to the military security complex, to the oil companies, just like the Republicans. So both parties then are controlled by the same money groups. Now these are new developments. It wasn't like this.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I appreciate that. And what do you think about the dollar and potential bankruptcy of the government?
The dollar is the weak link in the financial house of cards, but it is sort of protected because Washington has the European Central Bank doing quantitative easing. It has the Japanese Central Bank doing quantitative easing. These are the two other large currencies. So that, relatively speaking, what they've done to the dollar is now being matched by what's happening to the euro, what's happening to the yen. And the other currencies are not there. For example, the Chinese are still having this floating peg to the dollar. They're not a tradable currency in the same sense. The developments of this BRIC system, as is absolutely correct, they're trying to isolate themselves from the financial intimidation that Washington achieves courtesy of the reserve role of the dollar, the reserve currency role of the dollar. So they're trying to get out from under that, but it's not going to be any immediate crash in the dollar. As for the bankruptcy, we have to remember they can print the money. The bonds can always be redeemed. Suppose China said, okay, we'll teach these Americans a lesson. Let's dump our whole $1 trillion of U.S. Treasury bonds on the market today. Well, the Fed can just simply print the money and go buy them and keep the price up.
Yeah.
The vulnerability, though, is the dollar. If the Chinese dump the bonds and the Fed hands them $1 trillion and they turn around and dump the $1 trillion, Fed can't print foreign currencies to buy the dollar. So it's the dollar that is the vulnerability.
Right.
Completely correct about that. But Washington has all these ways. It's, as I said, it has the other two big currencies. They're being printed. It forces other countries to inflate, or else their currency is driven up and they can't export to the States. So they're sort of they're sort of covered. Plus, you have this tradition. People are just used to the dollar being the world money. That's what they're used to. You've got to break them out of being used to that.
I think another thing that could potentially undermine that is I'm hearing more and more about the new global financial system going to asset backing, whether it's directly with gold and silver and other commodities or through the SDRs. And if that in fact happens, and the U.S. has actually shipped their gold abroad a long time ago, and Russia and China and in India and other countries have been buying gold like crazy, our status through the SDRs or relative to other countries, if the dollar does in fact disappear as the international currency, I think that could be another steep cliff for America if we don't go along with these IMF reforms, at least to not be isolated in this new system.
Well, the dollar as reserve currency is a major source of Washington's power. It's the source of the corporate power, the bank's power. It's a form of American financial imperialism, American economic imperialism. It's also political imperialism. It's the fact that dollar is reserve currency is why we can put sanctions on other countries, like Iran and Russia. So for Washington to lose that role means it's essentially lost its power.
Yeah.
And so it's going to be very difficult to get Washington to lose that role, because Washington has an empire, and Europe is part of the empire, and Japan is part of the empire. And they answer to Washington. The Chancellor of Germany doesn't answer to the German people. Merkel answers to Washington. The British Prime Minister doesn't answer to the British people. He answers to Washington. The same with the Japanese. So the empire can be used to support the dollar. And that is one of the buttresses that Washington is trying to add with this Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Transatlantic Partnership, and the corporations. And certainly the banks don't want any asset-backed money. They don't want it. And they're powerful enough to be sure it doesn't happen. If the United States ends up with some kind of asset-backed money, it's after the collapse, when there's calamity, and somebody's trying to claw their way back up to something that will work. And it's not anything that's going to happen as a result of a reform pre-crisis. It's just not going to happen. The banks are too powerful. They don't want that.
Yeah, I have a sense that the other countries. I have a sense that the other countries are preparing for exactly that move, and that if the U.S. doesn't get with that, we could be in real trouble, because they could potentially move on without us. And I think that that's why they've resisted for 5 years signing the 2010 IMF reforms that would begin the rebalancing. What do you think of that?
I think these things are a little more complicated, but on the whole, I think Washington is starting to harm its credibility because its statements are just so obviously false.
Right.
And in Europe, what is happening is all the Washington vassals, all the puppets, they're watching themselves be pushed by Washington into conflict with Russia. And they know that is something that they don't want. And Washington is pushing them so hard it may actually break up their willingness to continue in this vassal role. I think that's what Putin is hoping and banking on, and why he has not been very provocative.
I think we saw a preview of that with the recent Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, when the U.S. was encouraging all the other countries not to go along. The U.K. broke ranks, and virtually all the other countries except Japan joined them. I think that's a little it's a trailer for the next movie, I believe. But anyway, Sacha, I don't want to take all this time, but thanks for reading my mind with giving me the opportunity to ask Paul these questions. I read everything that he writes, and I always wish I could ask him questions directly, so this has been wonderful.
Thank you, Foster, for picking up that slack there. Paul, one question I have for you, premised on what you just spoke to, that Washington, that Cameron in England, for instance, answers to Washington. I mean, many researchers, myself included, Max, do nod your head violently if you agree with me here. Many researchers, Paul, believe that, or are seeing in our own evidences that, in point of fact, Washington ultimately answers to the Crown of England, and the Crown of England answers to the Bishop of Rome, and the Bishop of Rome answers to a rather strange shadowy lodge known as the Black Papacy, which has a great deal of evidences to support this erstwhile conspiracy theory. And that, in point of fact, the triptych or the trilogy of power that we're met with today is the same as it was some few hundred years ago, with a franchise of the Holy Roman Empire to Londinium, and from Londinium to United States, with Washington being the military arm, London effectively being the financial arm, and the Vatican, or principalities, of course, self-governing principalities protected by their militia, the Vatican being the spiritual power, so to speak. That spiritual power from Vatican, financial power from London, and military power from DC, being effectively the trilogy of power. How much truth do you believe is in that?
Well, I've never seen any sign of that. As far as Washington is concerned, and the neoconservatives, we, the United States, is the exceptional country, the indispensable country. Britain is routinely treated as a lapdog. It certainly do not believe anybody is answerable to the Queen of England, probably not even her own children. And the Vatican has been so damaged and is under such attacks that I can't hardly conceive of them as powerful. The power is in the United States because it has the empire, it's got the money, still it has the agenda, which is American hegemony over the world, not the Queen of England's hegemony, not the Vatican's hegemony, but But
is that a black cat that just walked across our path?
She's not black. She owns the house. She and her brother own the house. It's Washington who says we have the right to rule the world. It's American hegemony that we see being exercised. That's the reason we've destroyed all these countries. I mean, we've bombed, invaded, destroyed 7 or 8 countries in the 21st century. If anybody in England were to try to break away or go in a different path, all sorts of bad things would happen to them. The NSA has probably got everything about their life. If it's anything in there, they would be, become a scandal, or they would be assassinated. A lot of these rising leaders and parties may not get far because it doesn't suit Washington. Marie Le Pen, what's her name? Not Marie. It's if she tries to actually take over France and change something, or leave the EU or leave NATO, she's not long for the world. These things don't suit Washington, so I really don't think that this is true about the Vatican or the Queen of England.
Foster, do you wish to speak to any of that?
It's full of itself. It's full of hubris and arrogance. And England doesn't have any money. All of the money is here, and we create it by printing it.
Well, surely
that because it's the world money, and everybody's willing to hold it.
Right. Foster, did you want to speak to that at all?
Well, it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out. My research indicates more to me that the emperor has very little clothes left on, but he's got, a big sword, and he's scared and very angry. I'm not sure how much money is left here. I think that on the surface, on the social and political scene, on the mainstream media scene, that's certainly the impression that we're given, this big power center in Washington. But I think that that's actually driven, when you get behind the scenes and follow the money, I think it's driven much more by the Israeli agenda, by the Rothschild agenda, that does end up tying back into the Queen and the Vatican. I think the Queen's got one of the great sort of shams going in history, where we all think she's this little doddering old lady who has no power, and Cameron really runs things. And I think when you really look to see who all the Commonwealth has to obey and who is actually controlling the money, I think we go back to the Queen, we go back to the Rothschilds, and then whoever is above them. And Sacha, you're more knowledgeable about that than I am. But I can't absolutely assure this. I just see if it walks like a duck and acts like a duck, it's probably very duck-like. And I think we're going to be seeing the revelation of what's really going on and who's really got the power quite soon, because I think a lot of this alliance of the BRICS nations and so forth is countries who have been playing their cards close to their vest and gathering nuclear weapons and million-man armies and making alliances and individual, gold exchanges and backdoor deals where they're not using the dollar and so forth. I think that they're preparing to move to the next stage, which will be, I think, much better in terms of a more honest currency and asset backing in the world. I think we still need to be very careful about a global alliance with complete global, financial monitoring and so forth. And my biggest concern of all is that the psychopaths and sociopaths that Gerald was talking about, don't want to experience any kind of partnership with the rest of the world in their lifetimes, and the kind of unilateral hegemony that Paul was referring to. I think that's what the Kissingers and Bushes and Cheneys of the world are living for. And it's going to be very hard for them to see anything other than that. So I do think that they're trying to create events that would go into martial law, that would cancel, international financial deals and allow them to print even more. I don't think, just my hunch is that it's not going to be allowed to happen by how many people are awake on the world, by whatever kind of extraterrestrial or interdimensional beings are keeping an eye on us. If they are, we can't depend on them. But there seems to be a lot of evidence of that, even from very high levels in the government, the agencies, the banks, and the military on that. So I can't say with absolute certainty, but I think we're about to see, the curtain go down on this scene and a whole new scene start. And I think that the topic of today, a big brother out of control, is a really useful way to help wake us up to what can we do in any case to prepare for the potential ultimate global clampdown of a police state, avoid that, and actually move very rapidly and very strongly and collaboratively toward a global voluntary, a planet of voluntary exchange of honest communication and honest money. It's a big challenge, but I think that we can do it, especially with the internet. I don't think when they had their agenda for the internet of total control, I think it was the Sorcerer's Apprentice, and it got out of hand and allowed us to have conversations like this and the research and the activism that they never anticipated would be possible.
Well, that's a crushing irony, is it not? That the very tool of Big Brother has come back as his nemesis. I know that Max Igan wanted to interject with a few words here. Max?
Yeah, look, I think that like looking at the three city-states and the monetary control and the military control, this was sort of in place for a while, but there's a new player. You look all the players you were talking about before, Kissinger, Cheney, the Bushes, these are all Zionists. You've got to understand there's a heavy Zionist influence in the US government, which is controlling US foreign policy, and it's also controlling the British financial system as well. So though you've got these countries, you've got the American government saying we want US hegemony, they don't realise they're being played. They're being played by high people, and so is the British, they're being played by high people. The whole thing's being played by those who puppet the financial system. And when you look at this, you look at the agenda of the Khazars, Zionists, whatever you want to call them, with the multiculturalism they're promoting. Basically, it's homogenizing everybody except for those who adhere to the Jewish faith, so it's an us and them mentality. Now, that's who I believe is pulling the strings on all of this. If there's something higher than I don't know. But a lot of people have got their own agendas. People in the United States may well have the US hegemony on their agenda, but they're being played. There's a higher player that's controlling their actions. You look at what's going on in the Middle East, none of it serves American interests. It all supports the Greater Israel Project, a whole lot. So that's where all that's coming from.
Thank you. Paul, Craig Roberts, it's almost kept you almost half an hour longer than we'd planned to have you. In summary, is there anything that you'd like to say to the panel here?
Well, I think we've had a nice discussion. We can leave it where it is.
Good. Thank you so much for that. Paul, Craig, you're more than welcome to stay with us, but we did only ask you for 2 hours, and so if you do have to be elsewhere, please feel free to peel off. We won't take any offense, but we'll miss you sorely.
Okay, it's my bedtime, so I'll head out.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us.
I enjoyed interacting with everyone. Thank you.
Foster, can you remain with us for a few minutes?
I've got another call in 8 minutes, so I can just spend a few.
Great stuff. Okay, Paul Seils, Pippa, Max, do any of you have a question for Foster?
Yes, if you don't mind, I just wanted to sort of agree with what he said about on a spiritual basis. Earlier I said that, we should be careful about what we put on the internet. Personally, I am careful about what I put out there, but you know what? I just take everything that I do digitally as being read by somebody. So it's not going to stop me from doing what I'm doing. So on the sort of energetic level, it's not making any difference to me, but other people might feel differently about that. But I do think that, the whole reason why I sort of protested against this biometrics in schools thing was because I wanted my children to be able to anonymously protest. I think if we get to the point where the state is looking at pre-crimes and being able to see everybody and what they do all the time, then it will stop people from going out and anonymously protesting. And when you can only anonymously protest and be successful doing it against regimes, and if we're sleepwalking into this sort of regime state, and I think we've got some really sort of important decisions to make as where we go as a species. Are we going to keep the values of humanity?
We only have 7 minutes with Foster because he has to get
sorry.
to a You have a question for him.
Yeah, I was going to say, how do you think this sort of surveillance state is going to sort of pan out with how we evolve as a sort of spiritual race? Do you think we're going to be suppressed by it, or do you think something will come through?
Frankly, I'm actually more optimistic than I've been in 15 years. And, there is light at the end of the rabbit holes that I've been going down. And it really has to do with what I started to talk about before. There's like, what can we do about the surveillance state is the same as what we can do about GMOs and chemtrails and banking schemes and all of that. And maybe I'll just spend a couple of minutes before I have to leave talking about what I think we can do. I think, as I mentioned before, first of all, we get informed, and then we tune our own consciousness every day, tune our own consciousness to stay as independent but connected thinkers. And then, please, I invite everyone who's listening to this all over the world, explore this whole notion of authority. and press for sovereignty and individual accountability in every corner of your lives. And look for solutions that are based on principles, not on politics. In terms of a practical level, I put in chat some links to some blogs and events that we did that have lots of information on workarounds on encryption. And all the different ways that we are being surveilled and a lot of things that we can do about it. But we can expose the perpetrators. We can press for prosecution of any violation of privacy, of property, of security, of well-being, and all of that is being done through surveillance, not to mention all the other things. And then we can go for, ideally for restitution. There are going to be mass arrests all over the planet. The elite know it, and that's why there have been over 700 high-level banking and corporate CEO resignations. But my goal is not to damage these people, but to require restitution, have a true truth and reconciliation phase, and ideally move into healing. There are legislative acts that people can take. I'm not a big fan of legislation because I'm not a big fan of begging for crumbs from our slave masters, but still, it's a messy process. It takes a Martin Luther King and it takes a Malcolm X and everything in between. So if that's something that you find effective, go for it. And then the synergizing of independent groups. And I just love this panel. What this represents in terms of the individual thought of each of us and the vast networks that each one of us represents, and the fact that this conversation, that we don't all necessarily agree with each other, but we're respectfully listening and then sharing the best that we have to offer, and then sending it out to our networks of people who are also independent beings who want to think for themselves and not just blindly follow, some authoritarian leader. So this is a little hologram right now that can go fractally all over the world, and this is already happening in every area. So check out all different ways that you can be more effective in terms of encryption. In the meantime, don't ever trust that what you're sending out electronically, like Pippa says, is actually going to stay private. But there are things that you can do to increase the chances, and ultimately know that you are an eternal soul, that you are love in your heart, in your consciousness, and that will prevail. I've seen transcripts from refugees from the Illuminati who talk about these behind-the-door scenes where they sit around and literally talk about no matter how much money and force and manipulation and deception we put in to control the masses, something keeps sneaking through the cracks. And they simply call it the X factor. And I call it love, I call it truth, I call it the life force itself. And I think that this conversation was a strong modeling of that, and I feel really honored to have been invited and congratulate you all on the work that you're doing. We, at the Thrive Movement, we love knowing that there are allies like you out there doing it, and we'll do what we can to help you in any way we can.
Thank you, Fast, and of course we ditto that all the way. We'll be reaching out to you in the course of the next few days formally to connect with you regarding the International Tribunal of Natural Justice. But just so you know, the ceremonial seating is on the 15th of June, on the 800th anniversary of signing of Magna Carta in the United Kingdom, with our Chief Justice presiding, and we'll be doing the presentment of the first major cases that we're rolling out, which all connect to the parent corporation, which is really what all of us have variously been alluding to. And if anyone wants to understand the nature of the creature we're dealing with metadata and dragnet surveillance, effectively metadata and dragnet surveillance is the outrider that protects the parent corporation. It is but one corporation, and that corporation, in the etymological sense of the word, corporation is a corpse, a fiction, a dead thing, an elemental cloud intelligence that we have given through the abnegation of our sovereignty. We have given that animation all too much and for all too long. Foster, love you much, and please send our very best to Kimberly, and look forward to speaking to you shortly. Get to your call. You have T-minus 30 seconds.
All right. Thank you very much. It's been an honor. Bye-bye.
Great. Max, Pippa, Paul. climb into the mud here for a little bit. Paul, I know you've got further questions for Pippa and for Max. I'm going to be looking at some of the questions that have come through from folks at home, and I will then just chime in. But can I just suggest that for the next 30 minutes, Paul, you've got a 5-minute piece that you need to do with a slideshow. Would you just do that now? And then what I'd like to do is just open the floor up to Max and Pippa and to you, and just anyone can interject at any time.
Sure, thanks. Thanks, Sasha. What I'd like to do is I'd like to show a video now which was taken from the Johns Hopkins Symposium in the States, held about 6 months ago. And one of the persons that are on that panel is General Michael Hayden, who was the previous director for NSA and also CIA. They preface that by talking about what is metadata, and then I want to run through some of those slides. So I'm just wondering, Santi, if we can play that video, please.
You saw it, President Obama. We're not listening to your phone calls. We're not listening to the content. We're just collecting the metadata, which means who you called, when you called them, how often you called them, how long you talked for. That's all we're collecting, just the metadata. So you shouldn't need to worry about it. Well, you know, I take my cue from a former general counsel of the NSA, Stuart Baker, who said on this question, metadata absolutely tells you everything about somebody's life. If you have enough metadata, you don't really need content. It's sort of embarrassing how predictable we are as human beings. And that's the thing is, you know, with metadata, they can know when you called your girlfriend, when you called your ex-girlfriend, when you called your parents, when you called your children, when you called Alcoholics Anonymous, when you called a drug rehab center, when you called your drug dealer, when you called your political party. They know all of that. They can connect up. Who are your closest friends? Who are you most closely associated with? Who do you talk to all the time? Who do you talk to only sometimes? That's a tremendous amount of information that they can get. And we got it from General Counsel of the NSA himself. We don't even need content if we can get metadata. And let me just add, the program that we've all been talking about is a phone metadata program. But the law under which the NSA gathered this is not a law that limits to phone company and phone data. It's a law that allows the government to get any business records on anybody, and in their interpretation, literally anybody and everybody. And so they could get email records, who you've emailed, who's emailing you, what websites you're searching, what searches you put into Google. All of that goes to businesses, which then have those records, and under the NSA's theory of how American law should run, they can get any and all of that information, because it might happen that at some point, some of it might be useful to try to find a terrorist. To me, that's dragnet surveillance at its worst, and the distinction between content and metadata really is erased.
Is erased. And this is all done under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court is the secret court that weighs, as I said, in secret, the legal justification for putting together a search of metadata linked to a person or persons, and then gives it an okay or a not okay, and it is on a time limit. General Hayden, you can find out all these things David just said about me, about David, about anyone in this audience. That is a function of operational capability. I'd like you to talk about whether you're comfortable with that operational capability. If so, why? And how often is it used in the ways that David described?
Yeah, first of all, David's description of what you can do with metadata, and quoting a mutual friend, Stuart Baker, is absolutely correct. Okay? We kill people based on metadata.
We kill people. Yeah. So it doesn't get any more obvious or blatant than that. But if we can just run into the next slide there, Santi, and I've got to push through these pretty quickly because I know we're running short of time, and I want to get a bit more out of Max and also Pippa as well. If we have that first slide there, Santi, I just wanted to just comment on that. So what they're saying in effect is that this technology is it's obviously military industrial complex technology that's being interfaced that integrates with drone technology. So when we get the social programming of movies like Terminator, it's interfacing with that technology. So they're using that with the drone technology. And if we just move into the next slide, they're using it with the drone technology to target people to take them out with weapon drones. Further to what Foster Gamble and Paul Craig Roberts were talking about, they're now classifying activists and protesters as low-level domestic terrorism. And we're already seeing people in Australia being preemptively arrested, which is interesting because that's obviously where it's going. Along to the next slide. As some of you might have seen, David Cameron gave a speech probably, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 months ago also at the UN, where they're labelling non-violent conspiracy theorists just as dangerous as ISIS. So that's pointing to where that's going. Along the next slide. Thanks, Landy. I appreciate your work there. Department of Homeland Security Intelligence warns of domestic right-wing terror threats. So they're saying that domestic terrorists or the people in their population are the new target. Moving on to the next one there. For anyone who doesn't know, this is Pine Gap in Australia. This is an NSA facility. You have the NSA in the States, you have GCHQ in London, we have our facility in New Zealand has theirs. Moving on to the next slide, basically all the drone bombing that's being carried out in the Middle East at the moment is being driven out of Pine Gap in Australia. So they're collecting that metadata on suspects and using that as strike warfare. And if you see the next slide, Glenn Greenwald from The Guardian, who was involved with, was featured in the 64 documentary, he goes on there also. He's in The Guardian used to expose the fact that the NSA are using metadata for drone strikes, and of course the majority of the casualties there are civilians. The next one, please, Santi. I just want to throw this slide in. This is interesting as well. This is around a journalist, Michael Hastings. When we got February this year, he died or he was killed. But also the ability, I think, just about for most motor vehicles in the States that are built post 2008, also have the ability to be hacked. And Richard Clark, former counterterrorism advisor, he goes on to admit that that's conducive with, consistent with a car cyber attack. So people are investigating that further about what's happening here. I wanted to just touch on this next slide, Sacha, that you alerted me to, and probably you've got a comment on this in relation to Hillary Clinton's involvement with her email scandal using a private server in her own facility that was registered to a non-existent person and scrubbing her emails clean and all that sort of thing as well. If you wanted to mention something in relation to that slide, Sacha.
Well, I don't have anything particularly nice to say about this creature sitting before me, Hillary Clinton, other than to say that in my humble view, she's the most dastardly creature of them all. I don't know that much about her history other than the fact that in the 1970s she was in the White House already being accused of various activities, almost facing, and since that has been one of those who's deeply embedded in this DNA that has arisen in recent years. Paul Craig Roberts alluded to the fact that Reagan was the end of innocence, in a sense, in Washington was the time of Reagan. Well, I very much disagree with that. Max, I think you're probably more studied in this than any of us, but not to diminish in any way, shape, or form what Paul Craig Roberts' perspective, which is a highly intelligent one, but it is very American-centric. And as we know, in Europe, the American mindset is just not a cosmopolitan one. It just doesn't have that universalist edge and the capacity to see from where we can, in Australia or elsewhere, we're able to see far more of the picture. And that's because we've not been set up in the same way that the United States has been set up. It has been sequestered and locked down and closed into this isolationist, inward-looking complex, which is a culture that prevails, where Americans don't know that the world exists outside of the US, so that they will drink the Kool-Aid and eat the poisons and vote on cue and be propagandized on cue. And the Hillary Clintons of this world are the perfect embodiment of that nefarious elite that sits behind the veil and has yet come in front of the veil as well to drive the machine. So everything from her leaving office with Obama's administration a year or two ago, on cue, obviously, just after her ambassador had been murdered and been set up for a fall in Benghazi, and that's one thing that's a dog that's not going to stop biting Hillary Clinton's behind, that's for sure. But the point is, the way she left office and now comes back into office is, you know, as a pretender for the throne, is classic stagecraft. It's all we're seeing is stagecraft from this woman, and there is no separation between Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton, and George Bush Sr. and George Bush Jr. That is a stable, all horses owned by the same stable. One could even throw in other almost Rands like Giuliani and John McCain and Kerry. Again, Republican, Democrat, what a bullshit exercise. What a nonsense dialectic. Which is why I wanted to bring up the question with Paul Craig Roberts about the Jesuit Code, effectively. Getting back to the source code of this Hegelian dialectic and of this Illuminati-spun helter-skelter when white is black and black is white. And the whole paraphernalia of reality, the language of our reality complex, is divide and conquer and completely obfuscate the truth, turn everything upside down all the time. And what you get is ultimately a generational dystopia, which is where we're at right now. And that generational dystopia, it's the perfect breeding ground for Big Brother and what David Icke calls tiptoe tyranny, to inveigle our field of expression until we just look up one day and go, oh my Lord, isn't it amazing? My telephone was a brick last month, and this month it's a little thing like that. And then a year later, that's flipped into something even smaller and fancier, and then that thing can all of a sudden take photographs. Good Lord, look at that. Isn't that amazing? And that moves into moving pictures, then that moves into smartphone technology, and the next thing, we're being wireless all around the world, and there's no such thing as even having a wire to stick into something. So we're slowly abnegating our own mechanical connection. The tactile connection with technology is even being taken away from us. That's tiptoe tyranny. We like to think that it's technological innovation, advancement. It's not. It's fucking scary, actually. And that's what's on us. Sorry, folks, for going on my little rant, but I just wanted to keep a little subtlety of metadata.
You're perfectly on point, Sacha. Thank you. And that sort of segues into the next slide that I wanted to share with you around some of the solutions that were being presented at the moment. Companies like Silent Circle are now issuing and promoting the use of the sale of black phones, which it's fully encrypted and has the ability to get around the surveillance system. Just on the next slide, please, Santi, just quickly. I wanted to just pinpoint this as well. Cameron also came out recently a month or two ago, and he was talking about the banning of any privacy apps or technology and hardware, so they can see that where it's going with that as well. Next slide, please, Santi. I wanted to bring people's attention to this organisation called offnow.org. They're being very proactive on an activist level, and they're saying that some of the NSA facilities in the States where they don't agree with what's going on, that they have the ability to shut off the services and the power and the water to those facilities to stop them to function. So check out that website. That's very interesting as well. On to the next slide. If you get a chance, watch this documentary. It's free, it's online as well, The War on Whistleblowers. It talks about from Noam Chomsky's era right through to the action being taken against whistleblowers like Julian Assange and Edward Snowden, but it's also happening on a personal level, on the people that are facing action against themselves personally in government departments where they're not even allowed to have personal opinions about anything. Been told very firmly if it appears on Facebook or anywhere, it's grounds for dismissal. So that's an interesting point also. I think that's the last slide. Is it, Santi? Is that the last one of mine? Yeah, that's it. That's over for me, Sacha. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Paul. Just a question here which came in is, what are the requirements to lead us out of the fictitious control system without the need to fight it? Is New Earth Project such a path with practical answers, and how does one gain true sovereignty and responsibility? Well, just very, very briefly, the New Earth Nation, I'm not going to go into what that is because there's 101 media pieces out there which quite deftly describe what that platform is. And all it is an aggregated platform for sovereignty and consciousness to emerge planetarily in the way that Foster was explaining earlier about the fractal modeling. And in point of fact, exactly what Max Igan is talking about when he talks about his clusters of 5, which corresponds beautifully to the dodeca. So we rather like that, Max. But at the end of the day, what are the requirements to lead us out is you, the living man, the living woman, to emerge out of the fiction. The fact that we have allowed ourselves, again, generationally, to slowly be turned from organic beings, living men and women of the soil, into fictions where we are block black capital letters on bits of paper, the papers that Max alludes to. That is what the only way to exit the proverbial matrix is, to acknowledge that you are not the identity. You are not the fiction. You are not the corporation or the trust that was attributed to you at birth, and which you are effectively acting as a kind of flesh and bones collateral for. So when you step outside of that indentured servitude, and let's be clear, this is voluntary servitude, okay? Because you're doing it. You're doing it every day of your life. When you step outside, when you choose to step outside of that voluntary servitude and disavow the fiction and engage with yourself as a sovereign being, and that means to connect with self in the actualized sense. Okay, this is not a game for kids. This is a game for real grown-ups. This is not a game for cowards either, because you have to address self. You have to really look at self in the mirror but in order to engage that. And that is the only antidote to Big Brother, to metadata, and to dragnet surveillance. Because once you engage that space and you walk out of the front door like Pippa does, like Paul does, like Max does, certainly like I do, and you are not looking for permission, what you're doing is apprehending the status quo on a daily basis and going, hell no, no, no. This is the line in the sand. I'm the line in the sand. I do not acquiesce. I do not permission this. I do not consent. Now, the curious thing is that when you do engage with that sovereign expression, all sorts of metaphysical mysteries occur. And I don't give a damn how woo-woo this sounds. Anyone who stands in their sovereignty will testify to this. Their lives will be a living testament to this, that you invoke these higher dimensional intelligences. You bring to bear a different form of expression where you don't need to be afraid. You don't need to be afraid of the status quo or about challenging the status quo or about standing up for your brothers and sisters on the street, in a tube train. How can you address the complex that exists out there, the collective dystopia, myopia, dysfunction? You can begin that process of removing yourself from the contracts, the invisible contracts, literally removing them. And there's ways and ways of doing that. Again, go to Max's site, and you're going to see so much resource there. Go to the itnjcommittee.org site. I put the link in here. But if you go to those various sites, there's a great many out there, and research this for yourself. That's part of the first expression of consciousness, is to actually care sufficiently to ask the right question. Max, is there anything in my rant that I've missed out here for a sovereign?
No, you pretty well nailed it there. I mean, a lot of it is just a state of mind. It is. It's a state of mind. It's knowing who and what you are in your heart. You know, too often we believe we are the paper. We believe we are our birth certificate. We believe we are our stuff. We believe we are what other people's opinion of us are. You know, we've got to remember who and what we are. That's how they've been able to do all of this, is they've been able to lead us away from ourselves. And that's all sovereignty is. It's a rediscovery of self. And that's what it's all about. That's what all this is providing us an opportunity to do. You know, the more negative they make it, the more people they're waking up. It's just what do you do with that information once you wake up. And you've got to be prepared to step into your heart and realize that this is all just a game anyway. It's just a temporary experience. And that's what you do with it. And too many people go through their life in fear of death as well. I have no fear of death. It's the only part of life that's inevitable. And I believe I'm here to do something positive with this experience. And that's what we've been given every opportunity to do. And I think a lot of the stuff that they're doing, all these metadata laws, everything they're bringing in, it's fear that's making them do it, because they know their days are numbered. And the more they try to lock us down, all they're doing is succeeding in waking more people up. We can't be controlled. Human consciousness is far too creative for that. And so no matter what they do, we'll rise above it anyway. But people have to be prepared to step into it. That's the problem. People are in fear of stepping into it.
Thank you. Pippa. Love to hear a great deal more from you right now. I know it's 10 to 4 in the morning in London for you and I. I'm very enthused, again, to have you with us. Can you speak to how you see things moving out from this point on, and what and where remedy might lie?
Well, I think there's been some great speeches tonight, and I think Max is right. I think we've got to own it to a certain extent, and we're all spiritual beings, and it's a fear-based thing, I think, and it is not to be scared, not to let it sort of keep us down, which is why I foster the question, do you think the vast majority of people will be frightened into sort of stepping out of line and not being able to protest? But I think we've got to, you know, there's far more of us than there is of them. And we are really the ones that should be in control of our own destiny and of the information of our personal, spiritual, physical attributes. It's, I think, what was it yourself says, you know, put a copyright on your head. We're all complete individuals. And I see it as a positive, but I just think that, I think, again, Max is right, that the worse they treat us, the more people are waking up, and I think they're scared at the moment. I mean, what I'm seeing coming in technology-wise is like standing in front of a tsunami. You know, the next, if we don't do something rapidly over the next 5 years, it's a done deal. I think we've definitely got 1984 coming back to revisit us. I actually reread the book last year for the first time in about 25 years, and it made for a very uncomfortable read. And if anybody hasn't read 1984 or hasn't read it recently, do read it again, because it's very true.
Although it's not the same thing, is it? I mean, that's why I asked the question of Paul Craig earlier. Did George Orwell understate or overstate reality beyond 1984? And I rather suspect he understated it. So reading that book today, does it have the same effect as it had on our generation reading it 15, 20 years ago?
I think the suppression of the human values is still the same. The technology obviously wasn't exactly the same as it is now, but it is a suppression of human values. And again, on an energetic level, how does that affect us as a whole race? Yeah, this is what I said. You know, we don't need to teach knowledge to our children anymore. The knowledge is out there. What we do need to instill in all of us is what it is to be human. And I can see, especially with the RFID chips, there's been a craze recently, people implanting themselves. We're tagging old age people with them in homes. We're geofencing them. We could do the same with children. And it's taking away our humanity. We shouldn't have to geofence old people in old age people's homes, because we should be sitting with them. They shouldn't be wandering around getting lost and us relying on technology. This use of technology, our overuse of it, I think is taking away our humanity. And like having conversations and relationships is far more important than staring into a phone and giving all our data away. But like I said earlier, we've all got to evolve. Every generation has got to evolve with this technology now, because it's come so rapidly at us. But I'm very positive. I think as a human race, we'll mature through it, I hope.
I've long since dispensed with the word hope, and rather like Foster Gamble, I believe absolutely. No, I do not believe. I witness and know in my own truth that we've crossed that Rubicon. And the only reason why we're seeing such horrors in our midst is precisely because we've crossed that Rubicon, and that we're seeing effectively the shadow of time play out a rather tired and old and weary Babylonian hand. And that's acceptable, again, to anyone who's standing in sovereignty and who's conscious of our place in this extraordinary drama, your own place in this drama. It's all perfectly acceptable. Everything that occurs to you is meant to occur. Everything that manifests in your life, in your time space, is absolutely meant to manifest in your time space. And to own every circumstance, every event, and every relationship in your life, including relationship with self, is vitally important. If we're to change the planetary sphere, the collective consciousness, we're going to have to each of us address the essential questions to self. And only then are we able to contribute to the greater becoming, to the activation of what Jose Arguelles and a great many others have referred to as the noosphere. And the noosphere is that animated collective intelligence which is antithetical to the elemental cloud intelligence which appears to be controlling our so-called matrix reality, where human beings, as Max pointed out earlier, are having our time and energy harvested, systematically harvested, generation after generation after generation. And the curious thing is that most humans in history, certainly in the last 2, possibly 4,500 years and longer, it may well be, have been abnegating our sovereign expression through our spiritual devotions and filing into synagogues and churches and temples and mosques, and literally doing that and abnegating our true sovereign expression towards some totem, some idea, some imagined creature which has been drip-fed to us or spoon-fed to us or propagandized to us, called God or religious disciplines. And that business of consistently surrendering, abnegating our sovereignty towards an idea, a totem, is in many cases not devotional practice at all. It's idolatry. And it's very hard to recognize that when one has prayed a great deal or meditated a great deal and objectified a great deal with the best of intentions toward an object or an idea that was fed to us when we were young, called Buddhism or Hinduism or Taoism or Christianity. But in a very real sense, in order to engage that new pure truth, that animation of sovereign expression and pure consciousness in action, we have to address to what great extent we have surrendered sovereignty in our cultures and in our religious persuasions, in our intellectual and philosophical and spiritual pursuits. So I very strongly feel the need to wind down this symposium with that message and to impress upon the need to stop looking outside for the answers and stop, in a sense, blaming the world blaming Big Brother, blaming the Queen of England, blaming the Jesuits, blaming anything or anyone ultimately outside yourself. Only once you've become actualized and connected to pure truth in that sense, or central sun, or heightened state of consciousness, can we begin to affect that collective change. You know, we've had so many people looking in on this symposium today. It's been daytime in the United States, and I suspect morning in Australia, and certainly it's very, very late at night here for Pippa and I. We've had a lot more people looking in on the symposium than we imagined, and that's great news. To which end, I'm going to announce that we're planning to do another one in about a month's time, and we will announce that duly through the websites and through social networking. And pick up the threads from there, because there's a whole lot that we weren't able to get into tonight, and there's a lot of very deep questions that need to be asked. The biggest area of focus, as Foster pointed out, that we should be looking at is these solutions. What can you and I do? What can we do as an individual, as a partnership, as a family, as a community of right-minded people engaging in right action? Do we plant cannabis on all the street corners? Hell yes, if it feels right to you, go ahead and do it. There's no law to prevent that. There may be statutory bullshit. It's not a law. Don't concern yourself with fictions. Don't concern yourself with statutes and ordinances, codes and bylaws. They do not support living men and women. They support fictions. They support creatures that do not have your best interest or the interests of your children at heart. Do you accept being photographed in the streets by 6,000 cameras a day? No, you don't. Care enough to begin finding out who's responsible in your street, in your town, in your city for that violation, that infringement against your own expression, and then find that technocrat, that bureaucrat, whoever it is. It's someone hiding behind a seal of office, someone hiding behind a signature, and their signature on paper is what legalizes that process into manifestation of deploying surveillance technologies, things that infringe you, things that scan you and x-ray you at airports and effectively cause cancer. Whatever out there violates you as a living man or a living woman, you can be sure that there is a small gray creature with a signature that permissioned that into being as a functionary of the system. Find those individuals in your city, your town, your street. Care enough to do it. Find the wet ink signature. Go to the local courtroom if you choose, fill out a form, begin a private prosecution against that individual. Look up mass liability notices and get your friends and family together and instigate mass liability notices against those same individuals, against your commander-in-chief if needs be, against your queen if needs be. Do not be afraid of the myth of power. Big Brother is a myth. The myth of power, accreted into this huge creature that no one can quite touch or feel or name. And we need to transcend that. So we will announce shortly when part 2 is going to be, and I'm going to thank the thousands of people who've been looking in. It's very, very good news that we drew in the crowd that we did. And Pippa, thank you so much for staying up late in the UK. We're going to be in touch with you shortly to continue some dialogue with you elsewhere. And Max, great hero. So happy to have met you finally. We've been in touch on Messenger for a month or two, but so pleased to have met you. Thank you both so very much for joining Paul and I tonight.
Yeah, it was a pleasure, absolute pleasure to be here. And yeah, we have a real opportunity here for change, but we've got to start using the system against itself. We've got to be prepared to stand up and do it. We really do. If we don't, we're going to just build our own prison. And there are mechanisms. I mean, there's no question these people are criminals. Everything they're doing is criminal. This whole system of debt slavery, the fact that they're spying on us, it's criminal. And we have to dismiss them. And we have the means to do it, to stand up and do it if we can unite our communities. It's good to do symposiums like this. It's an honour to have been asked, and I hope we see some some positive change come from it, and some good approach by people. I've got to go now though. I've sort of run out of time, so I do have to run.
Much love to you. I'll be in touch with you in the next day or two. Thank you.
Thank you, brother.
Pip, please, your last word. You're muted there, love. Oh, your audio's gone down, Pippa, for some strange reason. I think Big Brother finally got to us. Is there anything at your end that you can do? No, we're not hearing you. There we go. We can hear you now.
No.
Carry on, Pippa.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now I can. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Yes. Thank you ever so much for inviting me. It's really nice to be able to give a voice to the next generation, hopefully, and the parents that I've been in touch with around the world, voicing their concerns on this. So I really wish you well with the next symposiums. This is a great thing that you're doing. It's definitely the time to do it. So thank you for having me as part of it.
Thank you, Pippa. Paul, are you with me?
I am, Sacha.
Great stuff. Last words from you.
Last words for me. Well, I think my message also is not to go into any hopelessness or any fear around it. It's the first part of the situation is for us to be aware of what's going on, and then not to go into any fear around it. That's the last thing I want to create for people. I just wanted to say thank you to the panelists for coming on board. Some amazing people to be associated with. I want to say a big thank you to you, Sacha, for your initiative and for pulling this together. And I know you've got a huge team of amazing, beautiful people in the New Earth Project that have been responsible for the last months in pulling this symposium together, which has been no small feat in itself. So power to you, and thank you very much for shining the light into the darkness for us all.
Thank you, Paul. That's very kind of you. Yes, indeed. And Paul deftly reminds me that I need to thank Mark Bentley, our operations director, for being a tireless associate producer, and Arahia Sundancer for maintaining my schedule and the schedule of our core management team as well, as it happens at the moment, and Avi Esther, my beleaguered producer over here, and Santi, my beleaguered producer on the other side of the Atlantic. Santi, thank you so much, my friend, for all you're doing. Last word to anyone listening in. The ITNJ.org is the International Tribunal for Natural Justice. Go to that website. I urge you, www.itnj.org, and also go to its corollary site, which is the www.itnjcommittee.org. That's committee spelt with 2 M's, 2 T's, and 2 E's for those of you who can't spell. So the ITNJ site and the itnjcommittee.org site are 2 pillars that you need to familiarize yourself with if you are asking the question, how can I get involved now, and begin to address the system through law, through taking on a legal or a lawful stance. The ITNJ is a new court system, global planetary court system, that's being birthed into the world. And we've got that court will be emerging in multiple jurisdictions around the world after the inaugural and ceremonial seating on the 15th of June this year. We have over 2,000 law experts, scholars, prosecutors, judges on our side, working with us, absolutely backing up what we're doing here. We have got representatives from foreign countries coming to England now and asking if they can establish the court in their own territory, on their own soil. And we have sovereign governments that have already approached us and begun the business of investigating cases to bring before the ITNJ. This is where law comes back, and it's for the people, it's by the people, it's that old cliche, but this time it's for real. It's not being sold to you as snake oil under the guise of hope and all of that nonsense. This is your courtroom, our courtroom. It's also going to have an open trial feature where we will be able to bring in tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people into the trials, where you'll be able to witness them from your home and see what's taking place. There will also be an e-governance technology which we can will be rolling out, where you can participate in a vote. This is not a vote that will determine the fate of a case being brought before the court. Not at all. It'll be outside of it. But we still want to see what the consensus is, what the feedback is from people as these tribunals are in session, like the Nuremberg trials at the end of the Second World War. It's a very similar context that we're deploying here. But the difference is we want millions of people looking in. Real truth and reconciliation, an absolution of the old status quo is going to come about when we understand what part we played in allowing this monstrous Big Brother metadata and dragnet surveillance culture to prevail in the world. It's all about you and me, ultimately. Folks, thanks so much for joining us. It's been 3 hours and 10 minutes. We will announce shortly the next symposium. Paul, falls to me to say thank you, brother, for being such a crusader in arms in this seminal area of focus, and look forward to having a great many more engagements with you in days to come. Thank you.
Much love and gratitude to you, Sacha. Thank you.